For that. Good morning, everyone. It's now 9:30 and the examination hearings are open. Welcome to day 6 of the examination hearings. For those who still don't know me, my name is Mike Fox. I'm the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to hold the examination into the legal compliance and soundness of the Mid-Sussex Site Allocations Development Plan document, to give it its full name. We'll just refer to it as the plan most of the time. We are being recorded on YouTube, of course. Introductions. I'm not going to go around the table at the beginning as you would do in a physical hearing, but when you would like to speak, introduce yourself at that time and also who you are representing, if indeed you are. Yes, there is an action note going round. The action note is alive and well. It's got 12 points on at the last count, and have a look on the website or talk to Charlotte about that. What else? Breaks. Yeah, I'll have breaks at around 11 for lunch, between 1 and 2. If we're still going on this afternoon at 3:30, which I think is questionable, but maybe that's false optimism, and we'll start again at 3:30. One more thing is site visits. These are now forming for the 17th and 18th of June, so they're firming up for that. And a route map of where we're going to be going is being prepared. Do see Charlotte for details on that. Is there anything else, Charlotte, at this stage that you need to say or want to say?
The actions list is published under your examination documents, I noticed, but the ones that you've added, you haven't sent to me yet. So I think it still stands at 7 at the moment. So if you send me the most recent one, I'll make sure that that's published. And I'll just wait for the council to say they're happy with the timings of the site visits, and then I'll make sure everybody who wants to come along gets to see that.
Right, thank you for that. I thought I had sent them, so I'll check on that. So this morning or today, we're going to be considering more housing allocations. We'll be looking at SA19 Crawley Down Road, Felbridge, SA20 Imberhorn Lane, East Grinstead, SA18 East Grinstead Police Station, SA26 Hammond Road, Ashurst Wood, and SA23 Hanley Lane, Cookfield. So if we start, and as my usual habit is that I will summarize what the main parties have said. So SA19, land south of Crawley Down Road, Felbridge, for 200 dwellings. And the council's comments are that the Barrett David Wilson homes intend to implement within 5 years. Access via 71 Crawley Down Road. No significant infrastructure requirements on this site. Flood zone 1. No significant impacts on the quality of the landscape have been identified. Reasonable bus services. Boyer planning say it's capable of delivery within 5 years. They've agreed the access with Surrey County Council because the site is right on the border of West Sussex and Surrey. So although the site obviously is within this plan, or I wouldn't be looking at it, its access goes onto land within Surrey County Council. There's an opportunity, so Boyers say, for improving public transport in the local area. No showstoppers. Good access to facilities by bus. Andrew Black Consulting say it's a logical allocation, and in support of it. Richard Barmby the road system's already above capacity, and any more traffic will be diverted into entirely unsuitable roads and lanes. So that's maybe a point we can come back to in a minute. Infrastructure First, Paul Tucker, states that there are already serious congestion problems along the A22 and A264 corridors. Is acknowledged by both Surrey County Council and West Sussex County Council, that critical junctions are already operating at overcapacity. And this is reflected in significant levels of rat running through residential areas in the town, problems which have been recognised in several planning appeals. And there's a WSP traffic study, which we'll be looking at further in matter 6 next week. And this study recognises that the A22, A264 Felbridge Junction is a constraint. Yes, we can look at that next week. So those are the main points I've got. Does the council wish to come up with any headlines, or do you want to hear everybody else first?
Good morning, sir. I think it'd be probably most helpful to hear others first. You've summarised very fairly our position overall. I think we probably need to get into the detail, and I noticed that certainly in terms of the major arguments that relate to highways, which I think probably are the consistent theme running through a number of the objections, we've got both the developer online and also Guy Parfitt from West Sussex, who I may bring in to respond to some of those matters when we get to that. But I think helpful to hear the objections first, if you can, please.
Thank you for that. So do I have any hands so far? Who would like to speak on this matter? Right, Jeremy Clark, welcome to our proceedings, and the floor is yours, sir.
Hello, I'm Jeremy Clark. I'm speaking on behalf of Felbridge Parish Council. I wish to point out that this site in reality was, so you've correctly stated, it is in Sussex. It is effectively an abutment onto Felbridge Village, which is a Surrey village and rural. This site is not in the town of East Grinstead. It's accessed by travelling north along the A22 into Surrey and turning onto the A264 and then into Crawley Down Road, past Felbridge Village Green, Felbridge Village School, Felbridge Village Hall, and lies adjacent to Felbridge Sports and Recreation Ground. It's variously described in the plan as a sympathetic extension to Felbridge, sympathetic to the landscape setting and character of Felbridge, and maximises connectivity with the existing settlement of Felbridge. It's clear that this site is intended to be an addition to the Category 3 village of Felbridge, rather than to the Category 1 town of East Grinstead, to which the allocation belongs. The Felbridge itself is a village with 2 principal domestic streets, Copthorne Road and Crawley Down Road. The county boundary runs along and zigzags across Crawley Down Road, such that as you go down the road, the houses on the southern side are in Sussex, then Surrey, Sussex, Surrey, and finally back to Sussex again. These houses in Sussex have no different amenities to their immediate Surrey neighbours, and thus must be at the same sustainability. They, like the Surrey residents, are highly dependent upon the infrastructure hub of East Grinstead town, but that's over 3 kilometres away. There is not line of desired travel from site SA19 towards East Grinstead. Instead, the residents have to travel through north, through Surrey to get to the town. Tangier District Council settlement hierarchy states, although the proximity of East Grinstead plays a role in Felbridge's sustainability, the settlement itself can only demonstrate a basic level of provision, and as such is categorised as Tier 3 rural settlement. This would be the same as a Category 3 in MSDC policy DP6, to which Ashurst Wood, the village to the other side of East Grinstead, is assigned. So Felbridge Parish Council see no reason why this site should be considered as being part of the town of East Grinstead. The location of the site is highly likely to give rise to significant car-based journeys. This was the finding from an inspector for Gibbshaven Farm, which is only 600 metres to the west. And he stated, so taking account of the available facilities, I find that for most daily needs, employment, schooling, and food shopping, there'd be a need to travel beyond easy walking distance. The use of sustainable modes of transport, such as cycling and public transport, would be feasible for many purposes and encouraged by the travel plan. Even so, there is likely to be a considerable dependence upon car use. So we have other sites nearby. In our Regulation 19 submission, I don't want to go through it in great detail, it's before you, but I would point out starting on page 15, we looked at the sustainability scoring of SA19 in comparison with SA18, which sits within the town itself. That's the police station, former police station site, which you have on your list. And the scoring shows that, in fact, SA19 scores higher than SA18 in relationship to facilities, which we cannot believe is correct, considering the considerable distance of SA19 from those facilities. An example is things like the distance to shopping centres. So if I pick something like environmental sustainability objective number 11, the indicators are things like households within 5 minutes walk to a bus stop, 10 minutes walk to a bus stop with frequent service, 15-minute walk to a train station. So the site itself is shown as having a significant positive impact against that. Yet the distance is 2.7 kilometres to the nearest train station. It's well outside the distance. Yes, there is a bus stop nearby, but it isn't a particularly frequent service at the moment. I accept the applicant's statement that improvements could be made. But nonetheless, this is a distinctly distant site from the town centre. It's actually 3.4 kilometres to the high street. So it's not an easy route to get to those facilities. So fundamentally, looking through the scoring, we believe that it's unsound as proportional data has not been used to assess its sustainability in comparison with SA18 or even SA20. The site SA20 is considerably better positioned for access towards East Grinstead. It has direct desired line of sight, line of travel towards East Grinstead town centre, and is far more conducive to having cycleways or other non-car based transport to those major facilities. We also feel, therefore, that SA19 is not justified in that there's underdeveloped site within the proposers at facilities at SA20, and that there seems to have been no consideration of actually increasing SA20's allocation by 200 houses and not using SA19, and therefore moving to a more favourable and more sustainable facility. Felbridge Parish Council has raised objections to SA20 as well, but we still feel that it's a more sustainable location than the proposal at SA19. So as a brief item, I think that's a summary of our position. I would like to be able to come back if there's further discussion as necessary. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Clark. Just stay on the line for a minute. Are you arguing, you're basically saying you don't like either site, but SA20 is the lesser of two evils? Is that what you're saying? Is that
I'm saying,
too stark?
I'm saying, that's a good start. I'm saying we feel there are reasons to object against sustainability on transport grounds against SA20, but that's the same situation for those sites and was mentioned earlier in the introduction. It is a more sustainable site, and therefore our level of concern about sustainability is far less, also our concern about non-sustainability is far less at SA20 than it is at SA19.
And do you have any comments or observations about the actual land that SA19 is proposed for?
Yes, it does have a.
So go on.
Yes, it does have a flood category 3 area within it, which reduces its land area. And we do make, in our representation, we point out density required using the remaining land leaves us to a housing density requirement of 31 dwellings per hectare. That is not in accordance with the Mid-Sussex design guide, which would propose a far lower density at the edge of a village. The surrounding area is actually at a density of 14 dwellings per hectare. So again, 31 would appear to be considerably in excess of that. The site area for category 3 flood zone is the site area. So the category 3 is defined without climate change impact, yet the NPPF requires that it excludes the land including climate change. So that excluded land is likely to increase in size, further reducing the developable site. If it was developed at only 14 dwellings per hectare, it could only deliver 84 dwellings. So we believe that there's a significant risk of under-delivery of that site in terms of meeting the 200, which was further reason why we felt that SA20 could have absorbed that number far better.
Right, thank you very much for that. And yes, we'll probably bring you in again if we need to.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else who would like to speak on this one? Yes, Councillor Ian Gibson, good morning to you.
Good morning, sir. Can you see me? Yes, can see me.
I can now.
Right. Yes, thank you. As I explained yesterday, amongst other things, I'm a parish councillor for Crawley Down and was involved in the neighbourhood plan. The neighbourhood plan area for Crawley Down touches the top end of Felbridge, and we regard it as a partner village in the network of these villages around this particular area and the importance of the gaps between them. So I want to endorse everything that you've just heard from the Clerk of Felbridge Council, Parish Council. I'd just make one or two extra points. He mentioned the Gibbshaven Farm refusal, which was a Mid-Sussex refusal. That was refused on grounds, amongst other things, that the proposed development would be harmful to the local settlement pattern. It was the other side of the road, but I think that the point is also relevant to this particular development as well, in terms of what it's doing to the overall pattern. The main issue that I have with this, in terms of the sustainability, and I want to argue that this is an unsustainable development if taken in the abstract from the 550. As I explained yesterday, the impacts of the development in Crawley Down and the surrounding area has already seen tremendous stress on things like school places. And that just means that there will not be, I think you can also see that Felbridge Parish Council have commented on the position for Felbridge School as well. You're going to be faced with 200 families possibly, or certainly a large group of children that are going to have to go and find schools some distance away from if this development was to go forward. The second issue I've got is the traffic. I would assume that you've actually taken the opportunity to drive along Crawley Down Road. You have. That's good, sir. You'll be aware of the ongoing development that's down there. I think I have added it up recently. There's currently 120 new homes being built in that slither of land. That's in addition to about 30 which have gone in, mainly at the top end in the bit which sits within the Crawley Down neighbourhood plan or slightly next to it. And the impact that I've seen as a councillor for Crawley Down is that the road out of it, because of the congested nature of the 264, and in particular the impossibility of joining that road at the various junctions, then the traffic which is either going to head south or perhaps west into Crawley simply comes up Hophurst Hill, rockets through Vicarage Road in Crawley Down, and then heads out through the minor road system of Wallage Lane, where sadly there was 2 fatal accidents in the past 18 months. I'm not saying that those fatal accidents could have been were directly related to the traffic, or that those inquests are still open at the present time, but we are expecting to see some junction improvements. So it's not enough to talk about the A22. you have to look, as the studies which have been done, to look far wider in terms of the road network and the impact on the minor road network in order to get a true picture of what these 200 houses, in addition to the 130 under construction, are going to do to the road traffic pattern in this area. So those are the points that I'd like to make at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right. Have we got any other people who wish to speak on this one? Jeremy, Philip Allen from Boyer Planning. Welcome to our proceedings.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, Philip Allen from Boyer, representing Barrett's in respect to site allocation SA19. I was raising my hand now just because I'll make a couple of points, but I mean, I was just meant to say that I'm joined by Andrew Whittingham, our highways consultant from Motion as well. So I might ask him to respond in due course to a couple of the highway comments, but specifically in respect to comments raised by Mr. Clark of Failbridge Parish Council. In respect to the site sustainability, you would have seen that we've submitted a transport assessment as part of the site library, document SA 19.6. And within that, which tables 3.1 to 3.3, we set out the various distances to the number of services and facilities that will be available to both local residents. And I would make the point that there's a number of facilities available from that would meet the day-to-day needs, both within an easy walking and cycling distance. The sustainability of the site, I would suggest, is underlined by the conclusions of a recent appeal decision that we referred to at paragraph 1.26 of our written statement. In terms of the views of whether SA19 should be seen in the context of East Grinstead, I think it's important to consider the spatial and functional relationship the site would have with East Grinstead. The site is immediately adjacent to the existing built-up boundary and is recognised by the topic paper 2, page 7. Planning permission has recently been granted for a number of permissions adjacent to the east of SA19, which are now under construction, which has a practical effect of extending the built form along south of Crawley Down towards the site, and so the site would form a completely logical extension to the urban area. As I set out within our written statement, Crawley Down Road is a regular bus corridor with up to 30-minute regular services to East Grinstead, and the journey time being tabled at 11 minutes to destinations such as the train station. In addition, Crawley Down Road is relatively flat, so it is attractive to cyclists, and there's off-road routes to East Grinstead through the site via the bridleway that connects to Worth Way, which is part of the National Cycle Network. And then, no doubt, in fullness of time and the delivery of SA20, that will provide additional connections and further enhancing the recreational routes of that, providing a pleasant off-site, off-road route into East Grinstead. I'll also note that Townbridge has signed a statement of common ground with Mid Sussex, which is document DC 13, which confirms that they do have no objection with the proposed approach of the DPD. And also, in terms of the schools point, I note that there is a statement of common ground with Surrey Council, who again don't object to any of the spatial approach being put forward by the DPD. So given the proximity to the range of sustainability facilities and services, I would say it's entirely appropriate for the site to be seen in context and extension to East Grinstead. I think at this point I kind of hand over to Andrew Whittingham just to explain the potential benefits we can offer as well to sustainable travel.
Good morning, sir. Andrew Whittingham from Motion. Can I just start with sort of one point on the flood risk? We were responsible for preparing a report on that as part of the development of the site master plan. That does include climate change. Just a point of fact there. Could I also, just while we're talking about sustainability, Mr. Allen's referred you to RTA SA 19.6. If I could specifically refer you to figure 3.2, which details the local footpath, bridleway, cycle connections, and also you may find figure 3.3 useful, which gives the local facilities. Specifically in terms of sustainable travel, we've had discussions with the local bus operator. They're very enthusiastic about proposals which include real-time information at bus stops and a contribution towards public transport improvements that may come forward in due course, strategic improvements as part of the A22 scheme between the Felbridge Junction, if we can call it that, and East Grinstead. I think that's all I'd like to say at the present time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that. In terms of the Felbridge Junction, if I've understood you correctly, you're saying there might be some improvements to that junction that they could put in. Are you saying that?
Sorry, I was referring to possible public transport improvements between the junction going south to East Grinstead Town Centre.
Right, so not any physical changes to the junction.
There are some improvements already planned, which include lane approach changes and signal timings. You may have heard reference to the Atkins proposals.
Yes.
Which are coming through as part of other development schemes, committed schemes that have made contribution towards those improvements.
Would you see any realistic possibility of improvement to that junction which will enable improved public transport access, improved bus access through the junction? Or is that a step too far?
That's not something we've specifically looked at for this junction, but in general, sir, it is of course possible to give bus priority at signals if that's deemed appropriate measure.
Thank you very much for your comments. Thank you. I've still got Jeremy Clark's hand up. I just want to see if there's anybody else who wants to speak first. And then I'll bring you in again, Mr. Clark, and then we'll go back to the council. So the floor's open if there's anybody else who wants to speak on this one who hasn't yet done so. But I'm not going to hold my breath on this. So, yes, John Litton, do come in.
Good morning, sir. I'm John Litton, surveyor, and I represent the landowners of the Crabbit Park area. The Memorandum of Common Ground has been referred to in a number of different contexts here. And perhaps just to get the sort of air clear on that, I'm really unclear myself as to what the legal status and the enforceability is of a memorandum of common ground. We will probably get back to this in connection with a memorandum, a late entry memorandum that was produced in connection with SA 20. But I would just wish to flag that up, and I wondered if perhaps one of those who are much more knowledgeable on these legal matters than I am could elaborate on just exactly what the enforceability is, and for in terms how this makes a contribution to delivery one way or the other. Thank you.
Well, it's an interesting question, and far be it from me to answer that as a non-lawyer, but I'm sure the council might be able to, will be able to help us on that later on. Juan Lopez, do come in. Good morning, Mr. Lopez.
So good morning, with you. Joining late to the discussion, but and thank you. On behalf of Infrastructure First, then, with me is Mr. Martin Wedderburn, who wishes to speak and address you in terms of various transport and wider sustainability matters, in rebuttal of some of the things that he's heard this morning as well, in addition to matters raised in our matters statement. So can I just be clear that you are presently addressing generally the matters that bite upon SA 19?
Correct.
Yeah, very good. Can I begin then by just turning to a matter that I heard was raised during a session that I wasn't present at, but just bore upon the interpretation or application to be given to paragraphs 108 and 109 of the MPPF. And you might recall the discussion that was had in relation to by two of the advocates. Dr. Bowes offered you an interpretation or application by reference to the Leckhampton decision letter. And so you might recall the to's and the fro's of the submissions that were made to you. But I recall Dr. Bowes drawing your attention to paragraph 235 in that decision letter. Can I just flag that I support that interpretation application as to what stance be taken to a junction or a section of the network that is already established to be congested as to give rise to identifiable severe impacts, and what assessment or approach is then to be taken to onward development that gives rise to any additions in impact terms to that section of the network. And that's the approach that was being faced by the inspector, you recall, in the Kidnappers Lane decision. And we say, Infrastructure First say, or commend to you, the approach that was advocated by the inspector there. Contrary to that position, it was submitted that a greater steer, if I can put it that way, be given through the authority of Hawkhurst Parish Council, and you recall that that was raised. Now, my understanding, although you'll understand I wasn't privy or didn't take part in those sessions, is that that authority was not then spoken to in any great depth thereafter, and I think that's how that was left. Unless I'm wrong about that, you'll correct me, but that's where it was left in terms of the application of paragraphs 108 and 109. Can I just add some immediate thoughts to that then at this juncture?
I will give the council the opportunity of coming back on this.
Yeah, very good, as they should have, absolutely. Hawkhurst, forgive me, sir?
No, do carry on.
Hawkhurst itself, you may be aware, was not an authority that was tasked with dealing with the proper application or interpretation that be given to 108 and 109 of the MPPF. Really, the ground of challenge that raised its head in that case, which is relevant because the judge wasn't being asked to deal with this matter head on, was concerned with the adequacy of the information in front of the decision taker to go on to assess the materiality of the additional impact in vehicular traffic terms on the relevant section of the network. So that's a relevant starting point for understanding that the Hawkhurst decision itself has some limitations, if I can put it that way, fairly to the learned judge, in terms of the essential question that was put in front of you. So can I immediately say that Infrastructure First position is that Hawkhurst is not an authority for suggesting that it is not open to the decision maker, i.e. you in this instance, to take account of the existing severity of a junction and to approach with particular caution a scenario whereby under SA 19, as we say, material and in fact highly significant, we say, and I'm sure Mr. Wedderburn will speak to further in his evidence, additional vehicular impacts are going to be added to the network as to bring into significant context the significance of existing severity on the network through the difficulty of the junction, etc. What I don't say is that if the additional impacts are adjudged to be immaterial, that it means that such schemes can't come forward because the existing status quo is that the junction is congested or the section of the network is congested. So all eyes therefore are on the materiality of the additional impact. So at that stage, I'm on all fours effectively with what the learned judge was addressing, albeit as a tangent point, if I can put it that way, within his judgment. But what you'll appreciate that Infrastructure First point to is that on any scenario, on any realistic assessment, all of the additional impacts on the network under SA19 allocation. Separately, I'll come on to say the same in relation to SA20, will be material plus. They'll be highly significant. So effectively, you're not in a scenario that engages with the discussions in Hawkhurst. It will be a position we will invite you take the view that unarguably it will be the case where you have a material impact added to a situation whereby evidentially it's demonstrated to be at severe and congested levels. And therefore it doesn't trespass on the discussion in Hawkhurst, and it is on all fours with the concern that was explained and was commended. You'll recall Dr. Bowes took you to correctly. It was a recovered appeal, and the Secretary of State agreed the position that was explained by the inspector at 235 on the decision letter. And so we say we're on all fours with that scenario. And so can I double up on the endorsement to you of the approach taken by the inspector in the Leckhampton decision? So with that, can I introduce Mr. Wedderburn, who has some immediate thoughts?
Before you come on to that,
Yes,
could you help me out on, do you have the appeal reference number of Hawkhurst?
I don't have on the Hawkhurst judgment.
On the Hawkhurst decision letter? Sorry. No, that's right. Go on.
Hawkhurst is the first instance decision of, it was Mr. Strawn, wasn't it? Sitting as a deputy of the High Court. Forgive me, Mr. Brown, for a moment, but it was the judgment, and it's the decision letter in Leckhampton that I'm interested in, sir. If you're looking for the decision letter underneath Hawkhurst, I'm afraid I don't have that to hand. I see Mr. Brown.
Do you have the Leckhampton decision letter?
I do. If that isn't already submitted before you, sir, we can arrange that and forward it on to you.
I might well have it, but I'm just shortcutting me rummaging through.
We'll have that sent to your programme officer.
That's very kind.
You may recall the Hawkhurst High Court decision was referred to by Ms. Sargent in her submissions last week. Yes. And it was she sent a copy to the programme officer at the end of that day. And I don't have a reference at my fingertips, but it has been added to the inquiry library. But it was
in which case, I apologise for wasting your time.
No. There's been a lot of paper, so it's a matter of just tracing it. But you do have a copy of that. That's where you'll find it.
That's very kind. Thank you, both of you, for that. Mr. Lopez, you're about to introduce your colleague.
I was. Thank you, sir. With that, and thank you, Mr. Brown. And with that, Mr. Wedderburn, just going to tilt the camera there. Martin Wedderburn of Wedderburn Transport Planning. Good morning.
Good morning, sir. Can you hear me loud and clear?
I can, yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Martin
Floor
Wedderburn,
is yours.
independent transport consultant. And I've been asked to talk about the sustainability particularly of the SA19 site. To put this in some perspective, the remedial interventions for these two sites, SA19 and SA20, talk about mode shift in the region of 2 to 3% percentage points on the basis of direct bus links to Gatwick and replanification of bus stops and various other interventions. 2 to 3% of 350 to 400 car trips in the peak hour, we would argue is probably not materially significant. Remember, we're talking about in the MSTS modeling about an area where car dominance is high, about 92% mode share in the total MSTS model. And if we look at the earlier stage reports, they looked at the potential for smarter choices and developments to have an impact. I can refer you to paragraph 5.27 of the MSTS stage 1 report, said that even at a 6% transfer within new developments would have no significant impact at a wider scale. Stage 2 report concluded that any effect would be outweighed by schemes that would release additional highway capacity. I think that position hasn't changed. But going into detail, actually looking at the individual points around sustainability of the site, pick up 3 points. Firstly, on the bus lane. Undoubtedly, a southbound bus lane on the A22 would have an impact on journey time and reliability towards Lingfield Junction, but you asked the right question, I believe, so when you asked about what improvements can be made at the junction at Felbridge, because for buses on the A264, it's the queue at the Felbridge Junction that is probably a serious issue. And as we set out in our statement, the very geography of East Grinstead means that it is the routes to the west that are very key in terms of traffic terms, and this is causing the problem at this particular junction. So without improvements to public transport at Felbridge Junction, the Lingfield Road bus lane will be actually of limited use, I would argue. In terms of walking and cycling, a lot has been made of links to essentially leisure routes, which, while welcome, we would question how useful they are for everyday use. Many of them are unmade and unlit. What would we expect to see in terms of a real mode shift to walking and cycling? Firstly, a design and access statement that clearly shows that there are multiple pedestrian access points to integrate with the surrounding development. That is something that is encouraged within the MSDC planning policy, but there is no evidence of that. In terms of cycling, we'd expect to see routes that meet quite simply the layman's test, H to 80. Imagine a young child or an older relative of yours. Would you be happy for them to cycle on the roads in East Grinstead as they stand at the moment? I think the answer is clearly no. And thirdly, in terms of travel planning, yes, there's a commitment to travel plan for some of the developments in East Grinstead. To put things in perspective, the local Sustainable Transport Fund monitoring, which I referred to in my section, at a 6.1 statement, found a 2.2 to 3% reduction in car traffic as a result of area-wide traffic planning plus physical measures. And some of the initial MSTS work talked about area-wide travel planning within East Grinstead. There has been no area-wide travel planning in the area. There have been travel plans for individual developments, but there is no evidence they've been monitored, enforced, or followed up. Therefore, we place little weight on the credibility of a reasonable travel plan for this site. Thank you.
And so can I just to round that off without turning the camera rather clumsily back to me for a moment, so I'll sort of shout from the sidelines, but that the significance of all of those factors taking you back to both Hawkhurst and also Leckhampton is, of course, where one is concerned with gauging the materiality of additional impacts on the network, if your status quo is accepted to be congested, as we say here, and properly characterised as severe, is that the overall sustainability of the site and the various sustainability credentials of the particular mitigations proposed, and that's both for the purposes of paragraph 108C and 109, and of course they both incorporate consideration of mitigations, is that if you are concerned, as Infrastructure First are, in terms of the mitigations coming forward in sustainability terms, it means that in effect the additions to the network will become that much more material. So that's where there's a direct connect between the sustainability credentials of the site, of mitigations coming forward, that's if they are feasible and deliverable in the first instance, and the materiality of additional impacts on the network in capacity and congestion terms. So that's the direct link, and that's why we say it's so important here and so significant to approach the mitigations that have been proposed in relation to SA19 with appropriate caution. And hopefully the caution is neutrally expressed, but correctly expressed within our matter statement, and add to that, please, the addendum, if I could put it that way, from Mr. Wedderburn.
Right, thank you for that. I'll take Jeremy Clark and John Litton, and then Andrew Whittingham afterwards. So, Mr. Clark, over to you.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back about the primary school at Felbridge, as it was mentioned earlier. Paragraph 94 of the NPPF says it's important that sufficient choice of school places is available to meet the needs of existing and new communities. Local planning authorities should give great weight to the need to create, expand or alter schools through the preparation of plans and decisions on applications. The location at SA19 is correctly assessed as being a 10-minute walk from the village school. However, the NPPF highlights the importance of sufficient school places being available. Other than proximity, there's no evidence that MSDC have assessed the school's ability to provide sufficient places. The school is already oversubscribed, and in fact, following a consultation last year, Surrey County Council have now changed the admissions policy for Felbridge Primary to remove the use of nearest school as a criterion within the admission arrangements, such that from September 2022, they will be able to prioritise Surrey pupils as it was unable to meet that local need. So in fact, there will not be a provision for Felbridge Primary to take on Sussex residents, even though they live directly opposite the school. Thank you.
Thank you for that. John Litton.
So I assume you're asking me because of a raised hand, but I didn't think my hand was raised. Have I got that wrong?
Case, that's fine then. Don't worry. Thank you for your willingness.
I don't know how to unraise it because it tells me it isn't raised on my end.
All right. Technical.
So I apologise.
Don't worry.
Yeah.
Don't worry. Right, before I bring the council in, I will go back to Andrew Whittingham. You've had a number of comments at variance to what you put to me before. And if you can shed any light for me on the relationship of paragraphs 108 and 109 of the NPPF, that would be helpful. Plus any response you've got to the points that were made in terms of overall congestion, etc. Mr. Whittingham, do speak.
Thank you, sir. Well, 3 points, I suppose, then. The first point is Mr. Wedderburn quoted, I think, 200 to 300 vehicles in the peak hour from the site. If I could direct you to my table 5.1 of SA 19.6, you will see the actual figures there. And those are agreed figures. The two-way flow is 100 vehicles in the morning peak. And of course, not all of those go to the Felbridge Junction. We estimate and have agreed less than half. So just to put that figure to you, sir. The second point on travel planning, and sorry, perhaps another figure you may not have seen. We calculate the impact from SA19 on the section we've been talking about, which is between the Felbridge Junction and East Grinstead, so the area of the possible bus lane, is a bit less than 2%. So to set that in context, it used to be, and probably still is, a sort of rule of thumb, a travel plan could affect up to 10%. Now, obviously, it depends on areas. West Sussex used to use that figure as a guideline when we calculate traffic generation, etc. So I just wanted to put that in context, that the impact from SA19 on the A22 is within the scope of a travel plan and the sort of measures that we've talked about in terms of sustainability for mitigation. And finally then, sir, in terms of the paragraph 108, 109 point, you will see have seen our representations basically concurring with and very much supporting the use of the strategic transport model, the so-called SISTRA model, and the conclusions that the consultants there gave in terms of cumulative severe impact. You will have seen the council's evidence on that, and we fully concur that the correct approach has been taken. And finally, sir, and I can give you the appeal reference if it would be helpful, but again, it's because there is no absolute measure of cumulative severity, it's useful to pick up the way it was phrased in a particular appeal, which said it is a high bar. Obviously, there will be circumstances relating to that case, but that's a guidance, and I ask you to sort of set 2% with mitigation compared to that high bar. Thank you.
Right, Mr. Barnby, I'll take you next, if I may.
Hello, Mr. Fox. I hope you can see and hear me.
Yes,
It's Richard Barnby. I'm a long-standing local resident. I've taken an active interest.
I'm very impressed with your back garden. I can see it looks good.
Thank you. I've been involved in planning matters around East Grinstead since 2004. I was an active member of the post-referendum campaign, which opposed the strategic location that was proposed by Mid Sussex some time back. And that included the area of Imberhorn Farm, or basically the area between Felbridge, Crawley Down and East Grinstead. And I'd like to just refer back to a comment that Mr. Marsh made yesterday, and also to a response that he made on the first day of the hearing. Mr. Marsh helpfully pointed out that the table in policy DP4, which allocates a number of houses to category 1 settlements, is part of the policy, but but under DP6, the table that points towards additional houses at East Grinstead is purely supporting text. And I'd suggest that that means that the district plan does not require housing development at East Grinstead. And I'd also like to go back to the point where, as to exactly what the purpose of the houses are that we're trying to allocate under this DPD, I made the point on last week that it was to meet Crawley's unmet need, and the council came back and said that I was incorrect. I didn't come back at that point, but I would refer the inspector to paragraphs 23, 24, 29 and 64 of Mr. Bohr's report, which I think makes it quite clear that the reason for the uplift is to meet Crawley's unmet need. And I think I'd be correct in saying that he accepted that the submitted plan, without that uplift, already catered for the needs of the individual communities in broad terms. And also note that the approach of the district council was to produce the district plan from a bottom-up approach, whereby they effectively agreed with the various neighbourhoods what level of development was required for their needs. And from that, they constructed the submitted plan. One other point I'd like to make, and that is we've had some discussion about Atkins 3 already, which is online injunction improvements, which I understand are still the agreed approach of West Sussex. And I'd just like to point out that there was a distinct limit, which was roughly 750 for do minimum, plus another 190 for do something. The essential difference being that under do minimum, there was no land take required, whereas do something required land take, which introduces issues of compulsory purchase orders, etc. And the point I'd like to make on this is that the council has already allowed more than that number in terms of permissions based on Atkins 3 being delivered, but it hasn't been delivered yet. And it seems to me that there's a danger of some double counting, whereby we ignore the fact that various developments have already contributed towards Atkins 3 and their permissions have been granted on the basis of that. And suddenly we seem to be ignoring that and saying, oh, we've still got this capacity if we now bring in Atkins 3. It does seem to me that that's not a very sensible approach.
Can you just give me I've got the figure of 750 for do minimum. What was the figure for do something? You said
It's 190 additionally. Now those figures are, I'm not saying I'm 100% sure of that, but that's in broad terms. I see we've got a gentleman from Mr. Parfitt from West Sussex. No doubt he'd be able to confirm the exact numbers to you.
I'm sure. Right, thank you for that. I'll take quickly Juan Lopez, and then I'm going to bring the council in on this.
Just clarification, so from repeating my points from before, I want to come in on Mr. Whittingham's point number 1. We're not disputing the number of vehicles in his report. Actually, I think it's well set out in that report. Just saying that we are viewing SA19 and SA20 and the cumulative impact of both developments as material to the Felbridge Junction. And the cumulative impact of the 750 homes will be, and the various bits of evidence agree on this, in the region of 300 to 400 vehicles per peak hour. It's cumulative.
Right, going back to the council now, do you want to bring in your colleague from the county council, Mr. Parfitt?
I'm grateful, that's all right. I don't know whether Mr. Parfitt does have anything to say, but before, I've got 3 points I wanted to cover just by way of overall summary, but before I got to that, I was going to ask Mr. Parfitt whether there is anything that he wants to add, bearing in mind that the arguments that he's heard toing and froing between the two highways consultants. Guy?
Hello. Right, I don't have particular things to say about the Atkins study, which has just been mentioned at the moment, as we weren't relying on that. The evidence is from the Sistra strategic transport study for the site allocations DPD, and what that has shown is that although the junctions are very busy and congested, it's not being shown to get significantly worse. What I will say about the methodology in the study is that the model is basically a single mode model, i.e. it hasn't got in it, and also it's what we call fixed demand rather than variable demand.
Hang on a second, Mr. Parfitt.
So the things that it does to respond to forecasted increases
Mr. Parfitt, you broke up about
in flows and those that would occur in real life.
Right. I've got a problem with this, Mr. Parfitt, at the moment, because I can't hear all that you're saying, and you broke up about 2 minutes ago. I wonder if you could just go back over the last couple of sentences that you said, so that I'm okay. I
can't hear you breaking up. Would you like me to stop my video?
Right, I can't hear anything now.
Video.
We had this problem with Mr. Parfitt's connection last time, sir. He went away and did something very clever, which made it work perfectly. Do the same thing today.
Let's hope we can do it again.
Try without the camera, Guy, because sometimes that'll help your bandwidth. Guy, can you hear us?
Hello.
You just want to talk without the camera on.
Point, but
Mr. Parfitt, the last thing I've got from you is about the congestion at the junction. Although it is congested, it's not shown to be getting significantly worse. That's the last thing I've got from you, clearly. So if you can take up your evidence from that point, that would be helpful.
I think we've lost Mr. Parfitt, sir.
I hope I wasn't a reason for that. So
No, I don't think you were. I think we were all having difficulties. He was breaking up on most people's line, and I don't think he could hear us either, which suggests that that's a two-way problem. So shall I just make my 3 points, and perhaps
please.
if Mr. Parfitt can rejoin, he can come in at the end. So I was going to deal with 3 things. The first was the point that was made first of all about is this Felbridge or is this Tandridge or East Grinstead rather? And so I fully understand Tandridge, for the purposes of their plan, may view Felbridge as an independent settlement and have it in category 3. Bearing in mind where the boundary is, that's perhaps understandable from their perspective. But as far as Mid Sussex is concerned, the site and the part of the edge of Felbridge has always been regarded by Mid Sussex as part of East Grinstead, and that's always been very clear in terms of the way in which need has been allocated. And so I understand if you live in Felbridge, you may have a strong sense of identity that goes with that. But sir, if you travel the road from Felbridge to East Grinstead, you will perhaps understand why Mid Sussex, at least, has regarded the area of SA19 as part of East Grinstead. That's the way that we see it, and it's part of a settlement at East Grinstead's level in the overall hierarchy. So in terms of sustainability and the varying scores, I'd simply really tuck in behind what's been said by Boyer and by Mr. Whittingham on behalf of the developer. The sustainability scores, in particular in terms of access, take into account a wide range of matters: access to schools, to shops, to services, to GP surgeries, to bus services, to train stations. It's a basket. It's a consistent methodology. It's been applied. On the whole, with some things there is always an element of judgment, but with this, the distances, the availability of services, the scorings are pretty well fixed from the framework that's there, and the numbers crunch out the way that they crunch out. So I appreciate other people may raise eyebrows at the differences in the scoring, but it's been done on a consistent basis, and on that basis, this site comes out reasonably well. So my third point, just in terms of highways, you've heard the submissions made by Mr. Lopez about paragraphs 108, 109, and so you will recall that this is an argument that was raised last week as well. So at that point, I rather stood back from what was essentially an argument that was being raised, not between the council and anybody else, but between two respective participants. I did that, sir, for the simple reason that lawyers are frequently criticised for over-legalising the words of planning policy and trying to break them down, when in reality what is set out in policy is simply a matter of planning judgment. And in my submission, and I will now go into the detail if I have to, if one looks at paragraph 108, 109, that is entirely true in this case. The argument that you've heard about what exactly paragraph 109 means is not one which you are required to decide or adjudicate on for the purposes of deciding whether or not this allocation is sound. If I look at paragraph 108 to start with, in assessing sites that may be allocated for development in plans, it should be ensured that A, appropriate opportunities to promote sustainable transport models can be or have been taken up given the type of development and its location. Can we put a tick in that box? Yes, we can. And you've heard the reasons why outlined by Mr. Whittingham. You will see the indications of it in the council's response. Can safe and suitable access to the site be achieved for all users? Yes, it can. Can any significant impacts from the development on the transport network in terms of capacity congestion be cost effectively mitigated to an acceptable degree? And again, the answer to that question, for the reasons that we've given, is no. In reality, sir, I don't think there is any legal point that turns on paragraph 108 and what paragraph 108 means. The argument arises out of paragraph 109, which says development should only be prevented or refused on highway grounds And of itself, that suggests that it's looking at a development control rather than an allocations test. But I park that. I don't place any particular weight on that point for the moment. It should only be refused if there would be an unacceptable impact on highway safety, or the residual cumulative impact on the road network would be severe. So as Mr. Whittingham said, that is a high bar. And so critically, what it says is that you should only prevent if it is severe. What it doesn't say is that you must prevent or refuse if there is already a problem on the highway network. And so that ties into the way in which I noted Mr. Lopez put it. He said, well, of course, we accept that if you're only making a very small impact, one that's not significant on an already congested network, we don't suggest that in those circumstances you could prevent the development. So I just ask you to pause there and take that a step further, because if that's right, and it must be right, that if there is no discernible impact, then you wouldn't refuse just because the existing situation is already bad. If that's right, then Mr. Lopez's argument only works if, as soon as you go over the kind of de minimis threshold, so that there is the potential for you to make an existing situation worse, albeit only slightly worse, in those circumstances that you automatically have to refuse or prevent the development from taking place. And in my submission, sir, that is patently not what paragraph 109 says. You may be into territory where you could theoretically do that, but you are certainly not into territory where paragraph 109 tells you that you must do that. There will always need to be a judgment about how much you are making the situation worse, about whether there is anything that you can do to mitigate that, and whether you are doing those things. And also whether there is a wider need which justifies any impact which is taking place. So you know we are at the level here of the development plan. This is not an ad hoc, unplanned-led development proposal. We're at the level of a development plan which needs to make provision for very significant levels of housing in mid-Sussex. This is, in terms of its proximity to a major settlement within the district, a sustainable site. One might conceivably, I suppose, be able to find less congested parts of the road network by going out to places in the district which have no schools and no shops and no facilities nearby them. Somebody made the point last week, entirely rightly, the closer that you get to those sorts of services, train stations, schools, GP surgeries, the more likely that you are to find traffic. And so that's entirely right. But it cannot be right that just because there is a slight impact or a more than slight impact on a junction that is already congested, that is a reason why you cannot allocate. What you have here in this case is a balanced approach which has been taken not just by the District Council but also by West Sussex in relation to the impacts and also in relation to the need to make provision for additional housing. There is not an insurmountable problem here. Necessarily, if you put additional traffic out onto those roads, there will be some sort of level of impact, but it is not at the scale where it's a problem, a reason for refusal, or a reason why a site should not be allocated, not least of all because those impacts can and will be mitigated as far as possible. And that takes us back, sir, to paragraph 108C. Can you mitigate to an acceptable degree? The District Council, the County Council are satisfied that the answer to that question is yes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that.
Half it is yet, or we might, if he's not, sir, we might just leave it there.
Okay. Right. Sasha White, QC, welcome to the proceedings. Do take the floor.
Thank you very much, sir. Good morning.
Good morning.
I hope my internet. Can you hear me okay, sir?
I can hear you. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Okay. I don't want to spoil your morning by being able to see me, sir. Sir, can I just make 2 points? Could you just formally record? I completely endorse what Mr. Brown's just said about 109. and I say this for three reasons. The first is, sir, I don't know, and unfortunately it's not before you as I understand it, but I was the advocate for two appeals which are highly pertinent on this matter. Hill Place Farm, which I'm sure you've heard about, which was a site in the southeast of East Grinstead, which was a Secretary of State call-in for 215 houses in 2017, it was determined. And all these issues that are now before you in the context of SA 19 and 20 were argued about, and whether effectively East Grinstead has a major problem and it would be madness to increase the housing requirements or housing numbers in East Grinstead. The Secretary of State considered that in terms and came to the view that there would not be a severe impact in the case of those additional 220. The second point is there's also decisions you will know in Felbridge Road. I was also the advocate in 2019 in two appeals in Felbridge Road, which again considered these arguments in the context of Tandridge District Council. And again, the conclusion of the inspector was that no justification for refusing it. So the simple point, so the overview of your consideration of East Grinstead is East Grinstead has always been contended to have concerns, hence the Atkins reports in 2008, 2009. People have always said we've now reached the point where 109 is in play. And as far as I know, every decision maker has taken the view those arguments are not justified in the context of 108 or 109. So I do ask you to look at the wider scope than merely the context of the objection of infrastructure first. Thank you.
Thank you. Just bear with me a minute. Are we in a position yet to invite Guy Parfit back? Or
I understand we are, sir. I'm keeping my fingers crossed, but I'm told he does have a couple of points he wishes to add. So we'll see how we go.
Right, Mr. Parfit,
Hello.
welcome a second time. The floor is yours.
Hello. Hello. I'm sorry if I cut out before, so I'm not risking the camera this time. So what I wanted to talk about was to do with the strategic transport study by Sistra, which is the main transport evidence base for this, as opposed to the older Atkins report. I do consider that the methodology we have used is cumulative. It's taken all the committed and previously allocated development into account before looking at the currently proposed allocations. Although it seems you've mainly been talking about SA 19 this morning, the transport evidence does, of course, consider the impacts of all the sites together, and it hasn't found a severe impact at the A22, A264 Felbridge Junction or the A22 and Imberhorn Road Junction. In the model, this is largely to do with rerouting. What I do want to say about the model is that it's not sophisticated enough to take into account every change in travel patterns that might occur in the real world. So rerouting is its primary response to congested conditions in terms of how people would change their travel patterns as a result of changes in traffic at congested locations. We've, as has been referred to, we have assumed through the assessment very minor shifts towards public transport of 3% for the Imberhorn site and 2% for the Felbridge site, and also the small site at East Grinstead's police station. and those are looking to be brought forward through improvements for public transports. There is a scheme being worked on for bus priority on the London roads, people also may change their travel patterns, such as changing the timing of trips, the changing of frequency of trips, and for those journeys where they have the choice what the destination is. So in reference to the amount of development over the previous few years and previous assessments from the Atkins study over capacity, I would look to the real world effect of that. Can be seen by looking at the observed traffic counts figures. I'm sorry you don't have them before you, but I've looked at the county council has a permanent traffic counter site, which is on the A22 between the Felbridge junction and the Imberhorn Lane junction, and it shows no significant change in traffic volumes, either when we look just at the peaks on their own or when we look at the whole day over many years. So the most recent
Can you
figures.
be more precise on that, Mr. Parfitt, for me? When you say over many years, can you give me some dates?
Yes, I was just about to. Yes.
I'm sorry.
Okay. So the most recent whole year figures pre-COVID are for 2019, and in the AM peak, we have an average across the whole year of 2,037 trips. That's two-way flows, and in the PM peak of 2,180. Now, I've looked at various previous years. In 2014, it was in the AM it was 2,048, and in the PM 2,215. In 2010, in the AM it was 2,077, and in the PM 2,240. The oldest data I have, where we have a full year of data available to take an average, is 2007, and in that year in the AM it was 2,171, and in the PM 2,359. So there's been a slight decrease from 2007 to 2010, and since then the level of traffic through those junctions has been approximately flat. And the picture is much the same when we look at full day flows. In 2019, an average weekday was 29,412. If we look back to 2010, an average weekday was 29,120. Those are two-way vehicle figures taken directly from our permanent counter on the A22. So it does mean that the traffic assessments, whether the modelling methodology for the individual studies for the site promotions, the previous Atkins work, or the current Sistra work, in that case can represent a bit of a worst case, because traffic does tend to find a level. Nonetheless, we are looking to work on junction improvements for the location, because although the rerouting forecast in the model isn't seen as a severe impact for the through route, it's nonetheless not something we find particularly desirable or helpful. So it's something we would like to address. So there has been work going on between the four authorities of West Sussex County Council, Surrey County Council, Mid Sussex District Council and Tandridge District Council to look at longer term options for the pair of junctions. But to do that effectively, we need certainty on the amount of development that's going to be brought forward in Tandridge, which is currently doubtful. So that work is currently on hold. But as I said, we don't see the evidence that we have does not give us a severe impact without that. So we're not relying on it for the acceptability in principle of the proposed sites, but it will should demonstrate that we're looking to improve the situation going forward, both through junction improvements and through improvements for buses.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Parfit. Very well put. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will bring the council in at the end. If there are brief comments from Juan Lopez and Jeremy Clark, I'll take them now. I do want to make some progress because we're still on the first site out of 5 today. If you have some brief comments, Mr. Lopez, I'll take them now.
So I wonder rather cheekily whether you might hear from Mr. Clark first, and then Mr. Wedderburn's got some afterthoughts, very briefly put, in terms of what you just heard.
Mr. Clark.
Thank you. Yes, I'll be as brief as I can. I didn't talk about transport earlier. I think under your MIQs, you had it down as item 6. I would refer you to the appeal that Mr. White referred to, which is 319-8090.
319, just give that again.
319-8090. The decision.
What was the name of that appeal?
It is 17 Copthorne Road and 15, sorry, that one's 17 Copthorne Road. It had 2 parts, considered 2 sites.
So it's Copthorne Road. What was the number of dwellings on that one?
In total, 120.
Was that allowed? Or
yes, it was allowed. As Mr. White said, the decision was that its actual incremental impact was small. I'd refer you to the decision notice because the appeal considered at length the congestion, and the inspector has written some very pertinent observations about what the congestion actually is and what the impact is on residents in the area. He notes that over a 2-hour period, an excess of 168 cars approach the junction compared to those that pass through. So the queue, or the delays of cars, grows by 168 over a 2-hour period. He notes cars taking 9 minutes to travel the hold up from Roeplat Lane to the Starlights, a distance of 1 kilometre. So we have backing up traffic at a kilometre's length. The appeal saw a 3-day continuous static video camera survey submitted by Tandridge Council, which shows queue lengths in excess of 100 metres for more than 7 hours a day. So this is not a peak hour issue where we are just trying to make our way through a junction and we can avoid it. This is congestion for the vast majority of the day. The STS report from Mid Sussex actually acknowledges that there is rat running already taking place and rerouting through Turners Hill and Crawley Down to avoid the congestion at that junction. You'll see in our MIQ submission for matter 6 from Felbridge Parish Council, we've had recent communications with the Transport Studies team, Strategic Transport Surrey Highways, where they've stated that they actually haven't seen the STS from Mid Sussex, and in fact haven't been involved in that since 2018. But they also point out that they believe the WSP study is more indicative of the junction capacity at Felbridge than the Sistra study. The 2 models are built for very different reasons. The WSP survey was commissioned jointly by Mid Sussex, Tandridge, Surrey County Council and West Sussex County Council. and it shows that the capacity at the junction is already at 106% saturation in the current state. I accept the comment from the council that the WSP survey is related to the Garden Village, but we're talking only about the baseline. What does it say about the condition today, not about what the future condition may be with the Garden Village? The appeal I just referred you to, the inspector obviously noted those 168 more cars. Compared to the throughput of the junction, that's 112% of capacity over those 2 hours. So again, he's noting that the congestion is building up because of a capacity issue. The flows, I agree with the council, I've seen the traffic counts. They don't increase during the peak hour, but if the junctions are actually all at capacity and the most number of cars are passing through them, the counts will not increase. The cars that wish to travel at those hours will find alternative routes. So I'll keep my comments to that.
Very much. That's helpful. Thank you for that. Mr. Lopez, Councillor Ian Gibson next, and then I'll go to the council. Right, so Mr. Lopez.
Thank you, sir.
Final shot on this one.
3 very short points from me then, sir, and then I'll pass very briefly over to Mr. Wedderburn. First up, just following on from the council in terms of the WSP study, I was going to address you on this in terms of our Matter 6 representation, but can I just
certainly keep your powder dry for that one if you want to.
Well, let me do it that way, but just posit another invitation.
Yeah, headline or strap line now, and then we'll go on to Matter 6 at the appropriate time.
Just posit another invitation to the council to provide a justification as to why that study has not come forward as part of its evidence base, either by way of referencing and distinguishing, or to explain why they see fit that it should not be put before you. We simply don't understand that position. We've made that invitation to them a number of times. So I'll flag that and then readdress you on that under Matter 6.
Thank you for that.
Second point, rat running, and the councillor helped us with the fair picture being painted in terms of the increase in rat running and existing problems in that respect. And so that has a very forceful application to your consideration of wider sustainability issues for SA19, and I'll go on to say later SA20, when you are considering the significance of any material impact where you have a section of the network that is already identified as congested or at severe. And I don't need to go into any further what is agreed common ground with all of us, that obviously the question on severity is a judgment. It's perfectly correct. But the starting point, sir, is significant for you, that you already have congestion or severity on the network. It then follows, and I move away from the language of significance and simply turn to materiality. If you were to find that an impact coming forwards in transport terms is material plus, then necessarily, and just to take you back to Hawkers very briefly, and also the decision letter that I introduced to you, on both of those, on the judgment and on the decision letter endorsed by the Secretary of State, it would be appropriate for you to find that that is an unacceptable severe impact, having found a material impact coming forwards under the development proposed or the allocation proposed. And on that basis, it would be open to you quite properly to find, and Infrastructure First would find it surprising were you not to find, that the allocation is unsound. So I've rather fused there my points 2 and 3. Second point was rat running. Third point was just to come back very lightly upon Mr. Brown's point 3 in terms of the judgment, which we all agree it is. It's just to understand properly within the context of the judgment of Hawkhurst and also the decision letter, understanding the correct starting point. Whereas here you have a firm evidence base making out congestion and severity existing on the network, both for paragraphs 108C and 109. And so with that, might I very briefly turn to Mr. Wedderburn to address you shortly on 3 points. First up, he'll deal very briefly with cumulative assessment. Secondly, he'll deal briefly again with flat flows. And thirdly, rerouting. And now I'm going to play with the camera and give Mr. Wedderburn some exposure. Ready to.
Thank you. I've moved slightly closer to the microphone. I hope you can hear me better this time.
We're okay last time, don't worry.
Okay, good. If I can pick up, so just on the Mr. Parfit's point about it being a cumulative assessment, that is true of the Sistra work. One point we would like to make is that the work for SA19 and for SA20 is not consistent in that sense. Neither of them have included each other in their assessments. We do note, though, Appendix N of the SA19 statement that says they have actually specified a cumulative test, which seems sound. It's maybe of more relevance to SA20 because they're relying on a certain phasing, and I think a cumulative assessment there is much more important. Second point around the permanent counter showing flat flows. I don't think that's any surprise to us. If you have a junction at capacity at either end, that essentially you won't get any growth in traffic flows on the link in the road network in between them. And it probably does point to existing rerouting patterns. I would refer you, sir, to T6 in the DPD evidence, particularly paragraph starting 6.1.10 that talks about existing rerouting issues through Turner's Hill and so on.
Paragraph number again was?
6.1.10 onwards.
6.1.10 following. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And that talks about evidence of existing rerouting already. And that brings me to Ms. Parfit's comments about the model and accepting the limitations of what a model can show or not. If you have a junction that is at capacity, you won't show any growth at that junction, and that additional demand in fixed demand matrix will try and reroute. And he made the point that that's actually a simplification of the real world responses, which I would concur with. What I would say, though, is that in terms of assessing severe impacts, the real world behavioral responses may indeed also have impacts we should think about. So obviously rerouting impacts have both traffic and safety impacts on other parts of the network. And when we get to matter 6, we've made a number of comments about the way road safety is assessed in terms of rerouting impacts. He mentioned that people may choose to make less frequent trips, so suppress demand. That's also an impact on people's daily lives. People may choose to retime their trips. That's certainly something we see at congested junctions. If those trips are made at a different time of day, it is still an increase in traffic that has a traffic and a safety impact at that junction. So I think the point we're trying to make is, regardless of the behavioral responses, just because you can't physically fit any more traffic through a junction, there will still be a severe response, a severe impact in terms of the behavioral responses to existing and new users of that junction, both in that location and elsewhere on the other rerouted routes.
Right, thank you for that. I'm aware of time marching on this in terms of progress. I'm going to bring in new people. So I'm going to bring in Katie Lamb, and then I'm going to ask the council to briefly respond. So Katie Lamb.
Yeah, it's actually not Katie, it's Paul Cranley from Pell Frischman, who are acting on behalf of Welbeck and SA20. It was just one quick point, and we'll pick up on obviously on the wider points in regard to SA20 when we come to that further on in the schedule. But it's just with regard to the WSP modelling and specifically the A22264 Felbridge Junction, because a lot is seeming to be made of the existing position at that junction and the results of the baseline modelling within that WSP study. which, as has been acknowledged, is obviously has been undertaken for a slightly different purpose. But the 2 points which I wanted to make just with regards to that model were, firstly, as I think Mr. Whittingham mentioned earlier on today, there is a committed improvement scheme at that junction already scheduled to be in place, which is under the known as the Atkins Do Minimum scheme. So the future baseline position at that junction, which really should be considered within the modelling, should be that Atkins Do Minimum scheme, and rather than the junction as it is at the moment. And the second point, just in regard to that junction, is Mr. Wedderburn mentioned the limitations associated with the wider strategic model. Well, I think the other thing to consider here is the limitations associated with just looking at that junction in isolation. One of the key characteristics of this part of the network is the corridor operates very much as a corridor rather than simply junctions entirely operating in isolation of each other. And it's the behaviour of traffic across the corridor and across this part of the network that has more of an effect on how the junction behaves than simply the number of vehicles going through that junction at any one time. So it was just to make those couple of minor points, and then we'll obviously pick up the wider points with regard to SA20 later on in the day.
Thank you. Councillor Gibson, are your points brief? Because I'll take them before coffee if they are.
It's extremely brief, sir. I just wanted to echo Mr. Parfitt's comment that traffic finds a level. As a layman, that seems to me to be a very clear statement of what happens around here. The roads are a network. Yes, the level and intensity of traffic through the junction has stayed the same simply because those in the know go different ways around the network. Thank you, sir.
Fine. No, thank you for that. And I will take the other person that had the hand up before. Mr. Whittingham, was it? Are you still there, Mr. Whittingham?
Yes, can you hear me? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take your point, then we'll close for coffee.
Yeah, very quick point. Mr. Wedderburn referred to an appendix in SA 19.6 RTA, Appendix N, regarding, he said, cumulative assessment. We've had long discussions, obviously, with West Sussex County Council about transport assessment. And picking up the point Mr. Cunliffe made sort of recently, it is important to look at the corridor. In the course of hopefully a planning application, we'll look at the relationship between the Felbridge Junction and adjacent junctions. The only reason we haven't to date is because COVID got in the way, and obviously we couldn't undertake surveys. But if that's a requirement, we can certainly do that. And that, as I say, would be part of a normal planning process.
Thank you very much for that. Right, we're going to close for coffee now, and we'll come back at past 11. I will come back to Paul Brown as soon as we finish coffee. So 11:10 now, we'll come back at 11:30. So we're now closed until then. Thank you. Wasn't me. Right. Are we good to go, Charlotte?
Yes, we are. Yes.
Right. Okay. Back to the session being in operation. And Mr. Brown, there may well be you want to make to me. I just want to pick up 4 matters, 4 points anyway, which were discussed this morning, and see if you can help me with any of these. The first one is we were asked what the legal status of a statement of common ground is. The second one, it was pointed out or alleged that there is no evidence by this council, of sufficient school places in relation to SA 19. It was put to us or to you that we're close, physically close, but the schools were in Surrey and wouldn't take your pupils from Sussex. Third point is about meeting Crawley's needs, and discussions going backwards and forwards on that. I don't know if you have a view on that in relation to SA 19 and 20. And my final point, the WSP study has come up a few times, and there are some allegations of secrecy on this. I'm sure that's not true. Would be nice to have sight of that study, or at least the main conclusions of the study. So those are my 4 points. Can you help with any of them, Mr. Brown, or your team?
I can help you with 1. Kate Brocklebank can help you with 2, and I think Alice Henstock can deal with the 4th. As far as the legal status of statements of common ground are concerned, so you will understand that their purpose. This isn't to create some kind of binding Section 106 type agreement, which is going to dictate the way development will or will not happen for the future. It's a document that's produced really for the purposes of assisting you in your assessment of the issues that you need to consider in the course of this examination and the soundness of the plan. And inevitably, so for example, in relation to deliverability of sites, one of the matters that you will be interested to know is there a developer on board? What do they consider to be the likely trajectory or delivery of the site, and does the council think that it's reasonable? And the beauty of a statement of common ground is that rather than having to read two separate documents from two separate parties and compare and contrast and try and spot the difference, you can go to a single document which sets out the joint position. And that's very much what we are endeavouring to do in relation to the statements of common ground with developers in relation to future trajectory. It's to set out, so you have a note of what it is that we and the developer between us think is reasonable, what it is that's agreed. Doesn't mean that you have to accept it. It doesn't mean that that is necessarily what is going to happen for the future, but it's part of the evidence against which you will assess the examination of the plan. I'm not sure that I can say very much more by way of clarification.
That was very helpful. Thank you very much. Very succinct and very helpful.
So can I then turn to Kate Brocklebank to deal with your points about school places, and also I think there's an additional matter on which Brocklebank wanted to comment arising out of Jeremy Clark's observations as well.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Just to go back to the Felbridge submission and the correspondence that was appended to it from Surrey County Council, and just to explain that we wrote to Surrey, providing me with a chronology of our meetings through the duty to cooperate, the points that were discussed at each of those meetings. Indeed, we included where we've given them a heads up, so to speak, prior to Reg 18 and Reg 19, and identified which pieces of evidence we thought would be helpful for them to see in particular, of which that was the Mid-Sussex Strategic Transport Study, that's T7 and the earlier versions. We had a response from Surrey back on the 28th of May, where they confirmed their position. So regarding engagement with Felbridge Parish Council, they don't alter their views as agreed in the Statement of Common Ground. They confirm they're not seeking to change that document. They would like to point out that obviously it does identify continued work and engagement and partnership working between the parties as is set out in their Statement of Common Ground, which is DC 12. And within that Statement of Common Ground, it also refers to the parties agreeing that transport schemes are required at locations like A264, which is, and the A22 corridor. The Statement of Common Ground refers to transport schemes being required at these locations. It highlights continued working between the parties and to progress detailed feasibility work. And it also states that these schemes are required due to existing capacity issues. It acknowledges that this is demonstrated by the Mid-Sussex Strategic Transport Assessment, to say it's not required as a direct result of the traffic generated as part of the site's DPD.
I think, sir, that the point here is, and I can understand why, given what Gandhi has told Mr. Clark, he is slightly concerned about it, because he's had a message from them to the effect that they haven't seen or been kept in the loop with some of the work on which we are relying. And so we are absolutely perplexed as to how or why the county could reach that position in circumstances where, as they have agreed in the Statement of Common Ground, they have been to a number of meetings at which this piece of work that they've told Mr. Clark they've never seen before has been discussed with them, and we've effectively held their hand at every stage of the way. As Ms. Brocklebank points out, this is an ongoing process. But it is simply not right. It is simply not right that the County Council is unaware of what's going on, and indeed the Statement of Common Ground flies in the face of what it is that Mr. Clark has been told. I think is that a yes? So,
thank you.
Sorry,
Ms. Brocklebank, do you carry on?
Sorry, I was just going to move on to the point on school places, which is obviously linked to a similar issue, and again was obviously discussed with Surrey County Council during those duty to cooperate meetings. Indeed, a meeting was also set up with West Sussex County Council education team to discuss the matters of school places. And although SA 20 to the south of SA 19 includes education provision. Obviously, until we know the outcome of the sites DPD, we can't agree an absolute position, but obviously we agree to continue to work to find a solution through liaison with Surrey County Council.
But in principle, Ms. Bucklebank, there's no problem, is there? Or is there a problem? Mustn't put a leading question. Is there or isn't there a problem finding agreement with Surrey in relation to school places for SA 19?
No objection has been raised. That's yeah.
Right.
And so if I could make a quick point about the WSP report, perhaps.
Yes, do.
Just to explain, it doesn't form part of the sites DPD evidence base. It is a jointly commissioned piece of work that's been referred to by a number of parties between Surrey County Council, Tandridge District Council, Mid Sussex District Council and West Sussex County Council Highway Authority to aim to address capacity issues at the Felbridge Junction and improve pedestrian safety. The report remains draft. It has not been published. The summary report has been published in support of the Tandridge plan, which, as we know, is still rather uncertain. There are no agreed findings and no agreed schemes from that report, and the work acknowledges that further work is required to assess the corridor-wide impacts from junction improvements. And until that work has been undertaken, a scheme cannot be finalised and agreed.
Thank you very much for answering those questions. Mr. Brown, back to you. Were there any other final points that you wish to make?
Well, I think there was one last point that you asked us to deal with, which is meeting Crawley's needs.
Oh, sorry. Yes, there was. Yeah.
I'm going to go to Alice Henstock, if I could.
Good morning. Yes, just to clarify this, the district plan housing requirement includes an allowance for the unmet need at Crawley to ensure that the need across the housing market area is met in full. There's no requirement specifically to allocate in close proximity to Crawley. We know that the travel patterns which confirm the relationship between where people live and work between Mid Sussex and Crawley, because of the communication routes, the rail, the road networks, we know that anywhere in Mid Sussex housing can contribute to the unmet need within Crawley, is within the same catchment. In any event, we have allocated site DP 10 at Peace Cottage for 600 units, which is right adjacent to the boundary with Crawley. So where there are sites available in close proximity to Crawley, we have allocated them, but the need can be met with anywhere across Mid Sussex.
So I think in the course of the representations that you've received, there has been some confusion over the extent to which the existing district plan requirement includes an element for Crawley, which, as Ms Henstock has just indicated, it plainly does, and she's explained to you how we've dealt with that. And the argument which has been advanced by a number of participants, as you remember from day one, that this site allocations DPD should be going beyond the district plan requirements and addressing other Crawley needs that have been identified since the date of the district plan. And we've been very clear that the SADPD does not do that. It addresses what the district plan required it to. And to the extent that there have been any additional needs identified by Crawley since that time, those will be picked up in the district plan review, and that Crawley is entirely happy with that approach, as evidenced by the statement of common ground that we have with them. It may be, I don't know, it may be that that's been the source of some confusion as to whether or not there is any allowance in the SADPD for meeting the needs of Crawley. The overall district plan plainly does have a Crawley element.
Right, okay. Are there any other points, Mr. Brown, before I finish thinking about?
So I'm conscious that we've got a lot to get through. I'm also conscious that every time you kindly offer me the last word, and I try and take it, another 5 hands go up. So I'm going to rest at the moment and suggest we
Right.
move on.
In that case, we will move on, and we'll move on to SA20. Land south and west of Imberhorn Upper School, Imberhorn Lane, East Grinstead. And this is a site for 550 dwellings. And the council state that the site is in control of Welbeck Strategic Land, who intend to implement within 5 years. There are no significant infrastructure requirements, no showstoppers. It's required to be phased in to align with the delivery of sewage infrastructure in liaison with Southern Water. Reasonable distances to facilities, 25-minute walk, for example, to East Grinstead Town Centre. Judith Ashton Associates for Waits state that the redevelopment would require the relocation of the existing school, and this could have a significant effect on deliverability. That major new infrastructure works are required, and that the council needs to demonstrate that all 550 dwellings can be delivered within the planned period. DMH Stallard for Welbeck Strategic Land, that the site will deliver for the wider infrastructural needs of East Grinstead, and by that they mean aspects such as playing fields, land for a 2-form entry primary school, housing for older people, a 40-hectare strategic SANG, a local centre, and potential for a GP surgery. Therefore, Welbeck are saying it's a highly sustainable form of development, which I can't spell on my notes. Largely in single ownership. Substantial highways modelling has been undertaken. They're committed to early delivery, 2 points of access, no conflict with national policy, landscape impact acceptable. My point there is that quite a lot, it seems like quite a lot needs to happen. So again, I would reinforce the point, how likely is it that all 550 dwellings will be implemented within the planned period? Denton Homes, Richard Skelly, significant constraints exist. The delivery of the 550 homes in the 6 to 10 years is optimistic. For example, in relation to education provision on site. Andrew Black said the same thing. Turley for Rainier Developments, only allocated for C2 units, the only allocation for C2 units in the DPD. And that whole area which we talked about last week needs to be more focused. And that the policy should refer to a specific minimum C2 requirement in order to provide certainty of delivery. But I don't know if we've got Turley with us since, because I understand that that Mr. I'm trying to think of the name of the person it was now, was going for a COVID-19 jab, may not be here. Richard Barnby, the proponents don't have control of suitable access from Bourne Lane, and therefore no certainty of delivery. Interesting point. And Infrastructure First, Paul Tucker, that the IDP sets aside £1.3 million for all off-site transport costs. And there's a serious question of affordability as to whether that money could stretch to 5 key junctions along the A22 corridor. So a number of points there. I take it, Mr. Brown, you would concur that we ought to get other people in, and then you can come back and comment.
So with one exception, I agree with that entirely, but the one exception is you have very fairly summarised a number of the objectives objections, and in particular, one of the points that comes out again and again is concern about the delivery rate which is anticipated, largely connected with a suggestion that that may be delayed by the need to relocate the school. And so I think it would be helpful if I say right at the outset that that argument is founded on a fundamental misapprehension as to what the policy requires. And on that issue, I think it would be very helpful if I ask Kate Brocklebank just to say a few words, because once that's been said, it might simplify a great deal of the debate that we've got to come.
Kate Brocklebank, do come in.
Thank you. I'd just like to refer you to the site's library, please, and document SA 20.11, which is a statement of common ground between Welbeck Strategic Housing Limited and West Sussex County Council, which will help to reaffirm this point. There is a land swap that is proposed as part of the allocation. The land swap is to facilitate access to the development and will use up part of the existing playing fields associated with Inverbourne School. The swap will include provision of new playing fields and sports facilities, which are located to the north of the proposed allocation. And it will facilitate the expansion of Inverbourne School and a long-held aspiration by West Sussex County Council to relocate what is currently a split campus, the Wimble Lane School, which is the lower school, up to the Inverbourne Secondary School, which is adjacent to the allocation SA 20. So the two can happen separately, but this allocation will facilitate that relocation of the lower school and combination of the two and expansion of Inverbourne Secondary School overall. I hope that's clear.
Very clear.
Yes, indeed. And certainly the delivery of the housing is not dependent on that happening, and neither is the school required to carry out that site swap and expansion should they not wish to do so. But this will facilitate that happening.
Right, thank you very much. Let me have some hands, please. Who would like to speak on this one?
Tim Burden's got his hand up from Turley. He had an internet issue, so he has got his hand up.
Mr. Burden from Turley, do come in.
Good morning, sir. Sorry about that. I literally dropped off at the most inopportune moment, so thank you for letting me back in, Charlotte. Good morning, sir. Tim Burden from Turley on behalf of Rainier Developments. As you will have noted from our statement, sir, our specific concerns regarding this site are not in principle matters, but whether this policy as is drafted is effective and justified. Although I wasn't present at last week's hearings, I understand from my colleague that in the discussion regarding C2 provision, the council continued to state that there was no need for site allocations within this site allocations document. I'll try not to revisit that discussion in detail in these submissions, but they do provide a meaningful context to this proposed allocation. As our matter 3.8 statement set out, at the recent Albourne Section 78 appeal, the council conceded that there was a significant need for C2 uses, and you have the council signed a statement of common ground within our statement to exemplify that point. From this, it is apparent that just a few months ago, the council accepted there was a need for C2 development in the district, even when relying on their now somewhat time-dated 2016 Hedner addendum. Indeed, our own submissions similarly demonstrate that this need exists, and I understand that we're awaiting your comments on that matter following that hearing session. In this context, we now have a draft allocation that proposes within it, and I quote, the provision of a C2 care community for older people. It's the only allocation proposed for older persons accommodation development within this plan. Policy SA 20 includes reference to the provision of a care community, but with no specific quantum of such uses identified explicitly within it. They appear to fall within the overall 550 dwelling quantum identified in both policies SA 11 and SA 20. I note that the site promoter submission concludes that in reference to the provision of older persons accommodation, that, and I quote, a new development on the subject site will not fully solve the problem of undersupply within the area, but will make a positive contribution. Indeed, so that's regarding C2 provision. Indeed, the need for C2 development is similarly the case advocated by the promoter's planning consultant, Barton Wilmore, elsewhere at this examination. It's apparent that the promoters are seeking to understandably advocate this site on the basis that it would contribute positively to.
Right, you've frozen. And I can't hear you. Right.
I don't know whether Mr. Burden knows we've lost him, sir.
I'm doing well here today, so I apologise. Hopefully I'm back with you now.
Back with me now, yes, absolutely.
Apologies.
The last point I got is that you said that the contribution to C2 from your site wouldn't fully solve the problem basically for the district.
That's correct, sir. So yeah, if I may continue, I'd just like to direct you to the submissions to try and exemplify the concerns in this regard. So if I turn to the draft concept plan that was submitted, it's reference SA 20.1, which of course itself doesn't form part of the submission plan. This indicates a parcel of land to the southeast corner of the proposed allocation for a proposed care community, is how it's referred. We then turn to the draft capacity layout, which is reference SA 20.9, and this indicates a bit more detail and suggests a total of 109 extra care apartments / bungalows could be delivered, and the remainder of the offer relates to the provision of what are described as independent dwellings, totaling some 32 dwellings. Now, as you'll be aware, sir, there are various types of care provision, and the use classes orders somewhat blurred the line often between C2 and C3 uses. This has been discussed in detail in numerous Section 78 appeals, and I won't dwell on that point here, as you'll be obviously fully aware of that. However, it does appear from the promoted submissions that the actual proposal doesn't include for genuine C2 care uses, and therefore they would arguably not meet the care home needs that are required within the district. Indeed, it's unclear what, and indeed if any, care would be provided at these dwellings. That information is simply not before you. As currently drafted, the policy is neither clear nor unambiguous in terms of the scale and quantum of C2 units required to be delivered at this site. Through you, sir, if I may, it would be helpful for clarification to be provided by the council or indeed the site promoters on what is actually proposed at this site by way of older persons accommodation. The policy wording should therefore accurately reflect that, and I would envisage that some modifications may be required. If genuine C2 uses are proposed, then the policy should explicitly refer to what is being included within that overall 550 dwelling allocation. Without this, it's entirely possible that any future C2 offer could be diluted at the planning application stage. If that is the case, we'd urge consideration to be given to amending the policy wording to include a specific C2 requirement within the policy in order to provide certainty of delivery. Conversely, if C2 uses aren't actually proposed, then reference to the provision of a C2 care home for older people should be removed entirely from the policy. In summary, sir, our submissions are that as drafted, the policy fails to demonstrate that it will be effective in securing a quantum of C2 uses at the site, despite the clear evidence to indicate that there is an immediate need for older persons housing within the district, and notwithstanding the discussion under matter 3.8. The policy therefore fails to test the soundness under paragraph 35. As a final point, sir, we'd also note that the site demonstrates that the council is indeed capable of identifying greenfield sites to meet the identified C2 need within the district. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'll bring in Jeremy Clark next.
Hello, thank you very much. So as stated previously, the transport highways issues are obviously the same from our perspective for SA20 as it is for SA19, but actually at a greater scale due to the size of the proposal. And I'll just raise one other point, otherwise we're repeating ourselves. On page 29 of our Regulation 19 submission, we talk about lack of associated employment space. policy DP1 requires proposals to provide opportunities for people to live and work within their communities, reducing the need for commuting. The DPD has provided no new employment allocations within Felbridge or East Grinstead associated with the 772 dwellings proposed. Further to the absence of new employment allocations, there's also been significant loss of local employment space following the conversion of many office buildings within East Grinstead into dwellings. A key finding of the Mid-Sussex Economic Profile Study in 2018 is that there'd been a significant loss of floor space to residential conversions, particularly in East Grinstead. This study reports 19,440 square metres of commercial office space in East Grinstead. Since then, East Grinstead's stock of office space has continued to decline, with 12,000 square metres being lost as a result of a single planning permission for the conversion of East Grinstead House. The East Grinstead Business Association objected to the conversion as we have lost 7 existing, long-standing, large and well-known successful local businesses that have live leases and in combination employ around 1,000 people. That conversion yields 253 homes with potentially double the number of new residents needing to commute out of East Grinstead for work. Without additional local employment opportunities, these sites in East Grinstead will all lead to an increased need for commuting contrary to policy DP1. And we therefore believe that those sites are unsound. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Katie Lamb or whoever is speaking in her place.
Hello, thank you.
Back to you again, right, okay.
Me again today. I don't think we've heard from me today, so just to introduce myself to those who I haven't spoken to in previous sessions, I'm Katie Lamb at DMH Stallard, and I'm representing the site promoters of SA20 Welbeck Strategic Plan. We may well come back on, and probably will come back on lots of points that may be raised, including highway. So I don't intend to touch on that now, just to touch on a couple of issues that have been raised thus far. We heard from Mr. Burden, and I'm pleased to say that he supports the principle of C2 on this site and the need for C2 uses. Just to clarify a few aspects, the C2 shown on the concept master plan is in addition to the 550. It's not part of it. As in the description of the site allocation in the SADPD, it's for a care community brackets C2. My understanding of C2, and as we've heard, there is a grey area in terms of C2, C3, is that extra care and assisted living, which is exactly as it sounds, housing with care, is a C2 use, and that is the majority of what is proposed in our concept sketch layout, which is SA 20.9. That sketch layout was done for many purposes, including capacity. It is not a fait accompli. It would be in consultation with the necessary parties, including potentially a future developer of the C2 element at planning application stage. But clearly the policy is requiring a C2 use. So it would be for us to demonstrate that we are bringing forward a C2 use. In relation to employment that we've just heard from Felbridge, and I thank Felbridge Parish Council for their earlier comment on the sustainability of our site and in terms of its offering and its site location. But I think we talked about employment in East Grinstead last week. So just to reiterate that actually we're in a very enviable position in terms of access to employment, being adjacent to Birch's industrial estate. And as I know you've visited all of the sites, I'm sure you've picked up on this yourself, employment opportunities on Imblehorn Lane itself, on London Road at Felbridge, I mean, for example, at the Felbridge Hotel, and of course the opportunities that will be provided on site by the additional uses, for example, the care facility, which will generate employment uses in its own right. Those are the only points I wish to come back on at the moment, but we'll see where the discussion goes and may come back again if necessary. Thank you.
Just before you go, Tim Burden's comments about lack of precision on the C2, which there's a danger of the C2 being eroded unless it's, if you like, tied down more effectively within the policy. What's your view on whether there should be a modification to enable the site to be more focused on C2?
We've always put forward the C2 use as something that is needed and would therefore be marketable and viable for the development. As you've seen, it's on our concept master plan. We also have the capacity sketch layout. So we would have no issue or take no issue on there being some sort of quantum in the policy. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Andrew Black, come in.
Thank you, sir. In our matters statements, I set out some concerns that we had on some of the constraints on this site. Now, since that, I've looked through the documents that have been provided that are in the library, and I just wanted to say, so can I commend to you those documents? They are very detailed, and from my perspective, they set out that those constraints can be overcome. And equally, I think the vision document on this is excellent, and it really sets out that it could be a really good community that would come forward with the other uses. My one question, I guess I'm seeking a bit of clarity from either the promoters or the council on this, is that the policy on SA20 sets out the description quite clearly in terms of the housing, the care, primary school, the SANG, the playing fields, and then it talks about the indicative phasing in 1 to 5 years. And that really is our only level of concern here. So that it's quite a big allocation. There's quite a lot to come through, and just to try and seek clarity on, is it all of the things within the description that will come through in 1 to 5 years? What would be helpful, and whether this is, forgive me if you think it's unreasonable to ask, but if there was a trajectory for this site that could be set out just to show how they would get from where they are now to those units, it would be helpful to look at that. But that is our only comment on this. Thank you.
Any more comments before we go back to the council? John Litton.
Thank you, sir. I raised the question earlier. Sorry, my head is out of frame. I raised the question earlier about the statement of common ground, and I understand that it's not a legally enforceable document. Now, with regards to SA20, there are two very significant caveats attached to it. One is cabinet member of approval, and the other is the matter of valuation. And the valuation aspect comes out of the requirements of the Local Government Act 1972, mandating certification of best value. But it's significant there that would probably also likely to need to be subject to a full council resolution. Whilst I've no particular reason to think that might not be forthcoming, it does beg the question that will raise the issue that this access is across the county council's education land is going to be available presumably at the right price, or whatever represents best value, which is a matter which is currently unknown. So it's quite a big if, and the promoters clearly don't know the price that they will necessarily have to pay, and I suspect therefore they don't really know whether it stacks up. And should the valuation advice be that there is in effect a ransom situation of the sort that was the original case, there have been many since, is Stokes versus Cambridge Corporation, which is about ransom strips. Should the valuation be advised, there is a need to surrender a significant portion of the value added by the provision of that access, then the matter is of some considerable economic moment, not least because it might have effect on other planning benefits that the council might reasonably expect to flow from this, possibly including highways improvements. Now, I listened with care to what Alice Henstock said earlier about the question of the unmet need from Crawley, and that it could be met anywhere within the district. So from that, I take it that there is no hypothecation. The reality is, and this of course covers both SA 19 and SA 20, but I thought it better to get it all done in one go rather than have two bites to the cherry, so, is that it is admitted that the A22, A264 junction at Felbridge is already at or over capacity. And it isn't just a matter of where the capacity then gets displaced to, or whether new homeowners or existing homeowners suffer the inconvenience of finding that actually it's a no-go area for certain periods of the morning and afternoon at peak at times. Nor is it a matter that we can easily defer because of some notion that maybe work travel patterns will change in the future as a result of COVID and more people working from home. That's just simply at the moment not proven. But there are all sorts of other issues that aren't just about the physical traffic. It's about the amenity, the noise, the general environmental effects of traffic, pollution, visual disamenity, and never mind the displacement of traffic along significantly greater longer routes in order for people trying to find their way round. And I would commend to Sir the fact that if you examine what is happening at the crossroads at Turner's Hill during peak hours, that I think is a pretty cogent comment about a not very eloquent example of exactly what is happening here, because there is no doubt about it. Whether there are employment opportunities at East Grinstead, I simply don't see that the case is made that that is going to provide for 750 new homeowners. They are going to need to get east-west, and there's a very good reason why these east-west routes are so important. And I don't speak as a traffic consultant, I merely speak as an informed motorist who has to travel around, and I look at the property-related aspects of this. Most of the roads in this part of Sussex are what you might call a hub and spoke arrangement. The A22, the A23, A24, the principal roads are spokes mainly emanating from London. The frequency and capacity of the east-west routes that connect those spokes partway along the route has been, for all sorts of geophysical and historical patterns of development, much less well developed, and it's becoming a serious problem. Now, it will be no surprise to you that I'm appearing here before you on behalf of the owners of Crabbit, a site that was eliminated at a very early stage. But of course, I'm bound to say that a lot of these problems would have actually been solved by happening on a site such as Crabbit that could have been a relatively small development, up to 2,500 homes. There was a considerable degree of flexibility that could have been incorporated there that cut travel patterns and avoided a lot of the problems there, and of course been much closer to the main centre of employment, namely the Gatwick-Crawley axis. And it's mainly Crawley axis that is the logistics corridor here. So and bear in mind, the logistics is what services all the things that go on, the retail, the van deliveries and everything else to households. So it is a significant factor. The last thing I want to say about this is, on the first day, I pointed out to what I detected was a bias, and that was picked up in the afternoon session by other contributors. if you start off with an initial bias, then all sorts of other things naturally lead on to selective application of criteria. So that things like highways capacity matters at, say, Cravitt Park and other sites, but apparently not at Imberhorn, SA20, SA19, SA20, that facilities for work life patterns apply at towards the cohesion of Burgess Hill, but apparently not elsewhere. That developer control of land in terms of deliverability has to be demonstrated in detail on some sites, but apparently not here at SA20, where it is a matter that can be deferred to some future state. So it's the seeming ability to cherry pick at and the resultant apparent inconsistency that arises. It seems to me to be a hallmark of a failure of the basic need to analyse objectively and proactively and seek out opportunities. Now, in my Regulation 19 submission, I said that I thought that, I can't remember the words I used, but I thought that the council had perhaps not been picky enough. I think I was mistaken in using the terminology I used. It's the rigour and the consistency and the transparency of the approach that matters here. So whilst I think that it may well be that development at East Grinstead can be substantiated in its own right, it does seem to me that development of this size, this complexity, and this obvious implication for the highway network in particular doesn't stack up and does refer to what I said was a bias in terms of the selection process that has become, I think, more and more apparent as time has gone on. Now, it's really too late to turn the clock back, but I do feel that things like traffic, where we have an existing situation of overload, where there are obvious contributions to the A264 traffic from Tandridge, as well as from mid-Sussex, a road that, as we've heard, weaves in and out of the two districts and weaves in and out of the two counties, must be something that has to be addressed holistically, and the reality of it this stage, if there really is to be objective sustainability of these sites. In other words, use of puns, don't think you can kick the can down the road as is being proposed here. Thank you.
For those points, obviously the council will respond on whether they feel they're cherry picking with lack of rigour, consistency and transparency. On the question of the Felbridge Junction, you have heard the do minimum solution, which will allow another 750 dwellings through there. I just wonder if you had any comments on that particular conclusion, which has been debated earlier today.
Yes, sir, in the sense that the Felbridge Junction isn't the only one that is involved here. There are clearly issues to do with capacity at Junction 10. There are issues to do with the Copthorne Hotel roundabout. There are issues to do with the Duke's Head roundabout. And this is a road that is under, the A264 is a road that's under significant stress, but it is almost of vital importance in terms of the economics and the work-life patterns of those who live in. And Alice Henstock did point out that that it's important that matters can be placed, development can be placed anywhere, but it follows that there must be, and the link, I think, must be run in conjunction with and not in some unspecified tandem provision. And I think that 264 is not just a matter of the Felbridge. And I'm not an expert on traffic, and I couldn't really comment on the Felbridge junction, but there are other junctions where clearly no provision is being made for upgrading.
Thank you very much for that. Juan Lopez, do you come in?
So thank you. First, Mr. Wedderburn, he's keen to address you on three points. Firstly, corridor improvements and deliverability. Second up, put this way, SA20 seen in the context of the WSP scheme as a comparator. And then thirdly, technical issues. So perhaps first, if Mr. Wedderburn addresses you on those three matters, and then further to adopting the representations that Infrastructure First have made in relation to SA19, I've got some further observations in relation to neighbourhood plan policies. So Mr. Wedderburn, please.
Thank you. Yes, we've heard from several participants actually about the need to look at A22 and A264 as a corridor as a whole. And Sparfect referred to the overall strategy being highway mitigation and public transport improvements on that corridor. We're told also by Kate Brocklebank that the WSP study was not part of the evidence base, and that a corridor study is therefore still required. In our matter 6.1 submission, we made the point that actually the Atkins study, although very old, now is still the main study that has looked at all of these junctions together. And therefore, we do still find some of its conclusions valid, notably the 765 additional dwellings that it mentioned that have certainly since then been used up in terms of built out and committed sites. Essentially, if we look at this series of junctions, there is the Felbridge junction, there is the bus lane design scheme, there is the Imberhorn improvements that went in with the Wick site, but there are additional improvements suggested in SA20 submission, and there's the Lingfield Road junction, which we shouldn't forget, which is not that easy. It involves certain matters, including potentially a cantilevered footbridge of the railway, which is no easy matter. If we go back to the original Atkins proposals. In terms of the Felbridge junction, the WSP scheme, although not within the evidence base submitted by MSDC, we think is relevant because of the Tandridge previous HIF bid. It does give us a sense of the scale of change that might be needed. And we know that there's an option of improved highway capacity with pedestrian provision away from the junction, which would require some land take. And there's an option with increased capacity and pedestrian provision at the junction, which would require a greater land take. In the HIF bid, that was estimated at about £2.75 million. We certainly think that the option with improved pedestrian safety would be preferable, since that was one of the main objectives of that junction being looked at in the first place. It'd be rather perverse if they then opted for the suboptimal solution. The SA20 recent submission with the Visson modelling reports appears to be promoting a different solution at Felbridge Junction, relying largely on an extension of the merge lanes on the southbound exit to the junction. In the drawing 101470T015 in the Pell-Frischmann submission. One thing I'd add about this drawing is the existing highway boundaries are not marked, but it would appear that additional land take is required for this solution as well. And I would note that provision for walking in particular cycling infrastructure is not necessarily optimal under this solution. Turning more generally to that SA20 Visten modelling, mentioned already there's an issue with it, the phasing proposals and it not being cumulative. More worrying potentially is, well, in terms of the evidence base presented, it's actually very difficult to get to the bottom of what's there. There's very little presented that would give us confidence that it's consistent with the other evidence we've seen. None of the traffic counts are actually evidenced within the reports. We know that it's based on validated against journey time surveys, which according to, and give the paragraph of reference, page 31, paragraph 4.8 suggests that there are an average of 2 to 3 runs for each journey time section. Now the guidance within COBA and within other Visten modelling guidelines is relatively clear that journey time surveys should be obtained to give a level of confidence, well, 95% confidence interval of plus minus 10%. 2 to 3 runs almost certainly does not give anything like that level of confidence. So we have certain concerns about that modelling report. Certainly we would expect to see, if that were the case, we would certainly expect to see some evidence within that report that provides us with some confidence that it is consistent with the other evidence we are seeing from the other studies. So in terms of deliverability, we'll draw here on what we know from WSP and from the Atkins study and from the scheme drawings of the bus lane. The bus lane, I should add, the county council drawings clearly show that it is contained within the highway boundary. So it is essentially changing of curb lines and so on. Now, in our section, in our matter 6.1 submission, we tried to look at what the actual cost of all these measures would be. It's quite hard without knowing what land take is needing, but we're estimating something in the region of 10 to 18 million pounds for the whole lot, which for 750 homes is a hefty sum. So in terms of infrastructure deliverables, we don't think that the evidence base as presented presents a fair picture of what this actual total corridor improvement scheme would look like and how much it would cost. And we do not believe it's entirely deliverable given the amount of land take it will require. Thank you. Pass over to Juan.
Just before you do that, Mr. Wedderburn, you mentioned a range of 10 to, if I've got your figure right, a range between 10 and 18. Is that right? Million.
Yes. So
what's is included within that range? Is it are there priorities within that range, or what?
We are basing that on the Clandridge District Council HIF submission, which has a cost estimate. Well, if excluding inflation, back in 2018, it was at 8.7 million. That was a construction cost of 2 million, plus design fees, land acquisition costs, a 40% risk allowance, commuted sums, and client fees. The Lingfield Junction was 1.3 million in the Atkins study in 2012 prices. If we bring that up to 2018 and include the same allowances as the Felbridge Junction, that brings it up to maybe around 2.9 we estimated. And we think that we haven't seen a cost estimate for the bus lane, but maybe something in the region of 0.8 to 2.4 million might be plausible. depending on utilities, drainage, a variety of things, I'm sure. Maybe Mr. Parfait can comment on that. So this is the basis that we've come up to try and get a common level of cost between the different estimates.
All right, that's helpful. Thank you. So we'll go back to Mr. Lopez again then.
Thank you, sir. Arms aren't long enough to turn the camera, but can I just round off by on the transportation representations by adding that in relation to our reps regarding rat running and SA19, we think comparatively, albeit SA19 still presents a real concern for the action group with regard to present and projected rat running. Under SA20, we think it will be even greater, given the comparative increased proximity to existing residential areas within East Grinstead. So taking all of the transport representations made in relation to SA19 as adopted on SA20, that then takes me to neighbourhood plan policies and their treatment. And you might recall from our matter statement that we flagged within 3.3 from paragraph 1.1.1 two policies which we say conspicuously have not been grappled with or dealt with by way of any explanation in the context of what are clear conflicts, or at least one conflict, given the specific wording of these two policies, with EG2A. So EG2, you'll sir recall from your reading, is concerned with areas of development constraint. That's the first of two town-wide policies of relevance. EG2A prevents or seeks to prevent coalescence and the merging or coalescence of settlements, and as it's framed, gradual accretion of developments in the urban fringe. Now, it's approaching a prohibition, but it's a very clear steer against merging or coalescence of settlements. And you see the emphasis for yourself within the neighbourhood plan, fully in force, of course, articulated in paragraph 410. So the reference to that within the neighbourhood plan itself is pages 19 and 20, and C in particular 410. So pages 19 and 20, and in particular 410. And what therefore, against the basis of a clear conflict with that fully in force policy EG2A, the action group expected to see justifiably in terms of the site assessment performers for both SA19 and 20. I underscore this point bites in relation to SA19 as well, just as fully. It is some recognition from the council, and further to that, explanation as to how that clear conflict is dealt with. And it was raised preliminary fashion by way of some email correspondence between individuals with the council, and you'll see the tenor of that email correspondence at Appendix B of the representation. And it was properly said, but I don't think it really grappled with the point that was being made respectfully to the council. It was properly saying, well, in effect, look to paragraph 30 of the MPPF. And so you'll know in shorthand that deals with the scenario whereby you have a later in time adopted local plan that isn't consistent with a previously made neighbourhood plan policy. And it's said within that paragraph that in effect in that scenario, the later in time local plan adopted policy supersedes. So the inconsistency or incompatibility is reconciled that way. And that was effectively what the council were advising in that email. I have no quibble with that. That's simply restating the position that one finds advised in paragraph 30. That wasn't really dealing with the concern being expressed, which is how this clear conflict at this stage, at this point in time, is being dealt with or recognised within the local plan making process. And there we turn back to the site assessment performers, because both with regard to SA19 and SA20, they are virtually blank. You have recognition through simple listing of policies EG2 and EG2A, but no recognition as how they interface with the worthy, one has to, I think that must be a shared position between us and the council, the worthy importance of protecting against development these sites with regard to the importance of protecting against merger and coalescence of settlements. So no recognition of that priority, that importance, still less if that were then to be departed against through these allocations, either SA 19 or 20 or both, any recognition of how that is justified, whether with regard to housing numbers, etc., etc. So
Okay.
what we were looking for, forgive me, sir, is that, and that was seeking to be explored with the council again at early stage. This isn't any ambush point. We were seeking those answers early stage, and they haven't come forward. So it is our concern that what stands as a critical conflict presented by neighbourhood plan policies, the reference of which you have, which are not relegated in any way to this subsequent local plan making process, how that's being grappled with and understood by the council. But we do say that that very much stands strongly against both SA 19 and 20 coming forward, sir.
Thank you. I'll take the three names at the top, and then I'm going to stop taking names then, and I'll give the council a final chance to come in. So Jeremy Clark, Katie Lamb, Sasha White, and then presumably Paul Brown. So we'll start with Jeremy Clark.
Yes, very briefly, just coming back on Katie Lamb's point about employment. Felbridge Parish Council have no contradiction with her statement of the proximity of local employers. What we were seeing, though, was we don't see any new employment space. So the Birches Industrial Estate, for example, which is the nearest large industrial estate, these sites are fully occupied. So there isn't a proposal and potential there for a great expansion to deliver this employment of the incoming residents. So every business would have to grow significantly to take on that level of employment. Just coming back briefly to highways, I know you're going to discuss it probably at more depth next week, or so later, next week. The VISIM model that's been supporting SA 20, that's just been put forward very recently, is based upon journey times, as Mr. Wedderburn said. I wish to make the point that point G, the point at which they start measuring the journey time, is at the junction of Crawley Down Road and the A264, 300 metres from the traffic lights. They have not included the 700 metres of delayed traffic all the way back to Rowplatt Lane. And that is why the journey time between point G and the traffic lights is considerably different to that observed by the inspector on the appeal decisions I previously mentioned. The proposals for the change of the Imberhorn Lane to A22 junction, one of my concerns is that right turn capacity heading south along the A22 and right turn into Imberhorn Lane, the queue back in that lane is not increased in capacity in the proposals. It is already well known that the queuing traffic waiting to turn right backs up to the point where the last car obstructs the straight through southbound route of the A22, thus bringing the junction to a halt until the right turn lane is allowed to go. By putting another large development on Imberhorn Lane, it is highly likely or inconceivable that it wouldn't generate more traffic wanting to turn right. And therefore, there will be more times when the A22 south-north gets obstructed northbound from the case of the right turn being green, and therefore the traffic can't pass through it, and southbound because the queue of traffic obstructs it. The other point I'd like to make very briefly is FPC are concerned that what's considered as being Atkins do minimum or even do nothing, or do minimum, do something, how likely that is to come forward. The statement of common ground confirms all the parties agree to the necessity to implement the junction, but the delivery of those proposals isn't within the plan. The transport assessment does not include the benefits of that project, and the sourcing for funding of it was going to be a HIF bid by Tandridge, which then failed. So there is no obvious total funding route for that proposal. West Sussex Highways' response in the consultation was the DPD should acknowledge the possibility that improvements may not be deliverable at the Felbridge junction. So even the Highway Authority is questioning the viability of delivering those junction improvements. We therefore feel that the site allocations document is unsound, as the cross-boundary strategic matters identified in the Statement of Common Ground have been deferred rather than dealt with. They're not delivered as a result of this plan. They are just inferred that they will happen at some time in the future. And that therefore doesn't align with the desire to have a round plan. Okay, thank you very much.
Right. Kitty Lamb, come in, please.
Hello, thank you. I'm just going to come back on a few points and then I'll turn the computer to Paul Cranley to run through some of the highways matters. So just as a very quick introduction to deal with the points that have just been raised. The work that's been going on the promotion of lands west of Imberhorn Lane is 6 years worth of work between Welbeck, myself, Paul, the rest of the detailed consultant team, with significant consultation with a number of stakeholders, including statutory bodies. So you can be comforted that there is significant work that's already been done that aids the delivery of the site. I'll come back onto that in a moment. What we need to start with as our consideration of this site is the remarkable sustainability of it. This isn't just, as I think you introduced it, a site for 550 houses. That is clearly a benefit that must be weighed in the planning balance. It's a site allocations plan, but what we also must remember is the other public benefits that are equally as significant. Housing for older people. There's playing fields for Imberhorn School, which either provides additional and enhanced playing field provision or enables the consolidation of the schools. And I hope you've seen in our evidence, including the Statement of Common Ground with West Sussex, what the benefit of that is to them. And then, of course, they wouldn't have entered into that agreement, that Statement of Common Ground with us, if it wasn't very important to them. Land for a new primary school. A local centre with potential for GP. There isn't a GP surgery, for example, on this side of the town. Public open space and a strategic SANG of around 40 to 42 hectares. Now, the public benefits of that mustn't be forgotten either. So not only is it sustainable development, it offers public benefits. All of those uses also add locational sustainability into the mix, which I won't go into too much because obviously Paul will come back on that. I note Mr. Black's comments and thank him for the level of detail that we've gone into. In regard to phasing, noting that Mid Sussex have put in the site allocations plan for 1 to 5 years, I would note that our evidence to Mid Sussex thus far, if I bring it back up, is deliverability in the periods 2024-25 to 2029-30, when we believe all of the development will be completed. That's our best estimate at this time, bearing in mind all other matters. In regards to the implementation, for example, of a planning application, all the information done to bring the site to allocation stage has been incredibly detailed and akin to a planning application. And that work is all there sitting ready for a planning application. And indeed, we've submitted a draft PPA to Mid Sussex and intend to commence pre-application work on hopefully a positive outcome from this process. To come to Mr. Litton's point about the land swap, how deliverable that is and the impact that would have on viability. As I said, that process with West Sussex has been going on for some time. Historically, the County Council have actually approached our landowner and Welbeck to discuss additional playing fields. There is a long-held ambition for them to consolidate the schools, and that's held by the school as well. As I say, I won't go into it too much, but there are details of costs, investments, staffing, management. And although the site is not as Kate Brocklebank has said, reliant on that swap, it offers the land and future-proofs that for future years. If we weren't to include it now, Imberhorn School could end up being surrounded by development, and that doesn't help anybody. He's also completely correct that there is a process to be followed. I note that he wasn't concerned about cabinet member approval. As you can understand, at any council level, final ultimate decisions have to go through council. We understand from West Sussex that Department for Education consent has already been applied for although there'll be a net increase of over 4 hectares of playing field land, the county are required to approach the DfE to note the loss of some playing field. Valuation, again, Mr. Litton is entirely right, but our position is that there is no ransom. West Sussex have instructed that valuation work already. And of course, there are many benefits to West Sussex of the land swap agreement. I've mentioned the playing field provision. There's also the enabling of additional enhancements to that playing field. For example, that could be an all-weather pitch, pavilion, general enhancements, but also it unlocks development at Windmill Lane, which is allocated at policy SS3 of the East Grinstead Neighbourhood Plan. That's of significant financial benefit to the county. So he is entirely right that that process should and will be undertaken. Indeed, I believe it's in the statement of common ground, but we don't believe that it will have an impact on the viability of the development at all. Just coming back on Mr. Lopez's point on neighbourhood plans, I don't intend to go on this point. I think we've heard it enough through the examination. Neighbourhood plan policies are still relevant insofar as they accord with the most up-to-date district level plan for development management points. But we're in a position where that neighbourhood plan was adopted again prior to the district plan. It doesn't account for the housing needs of that plan. And unfortunately, that does mean to say that this site allocations plan will override some of the points in the East Grinstead neighbourhood plan. Other than just to quickly say that the plan also identifies a range of public open space uses that this site could deliver and of course will deliver through the allocation of land at policy SA20. I'm going to pass over to Paul now. He's going to come back on the highways points made in the discussion so far this morning.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Katie. Yes. So just firstly picking up on the sustainability point that was raised there, and just to reinforce the locational sustainability of this site being in a highly sustainable location, located 1.3 kilometres from the East Grinstead railway station, 1.5 kilometres from the town centre, and within the immediate vicinity of a number of key local amenities and facilities. I'd refer you to our hearing statement submission document, SA 20.4 and figure 2.1 and table 2.1, which provides a bit more detail about various amenities in the immediate vicinity of the site. As Mr. Wedderburn pointed out earlier on this morning, two key elements which enable sites to engender that high levels of modal shift are multiple pedestrian access points and direct connections to key facilities from those access points, and this site can deliver that via the access at Heathwood, opposite Heathcote Drive, at the pedestrian route via Chapman's Lane, and obviously the direct cycle route to the south of the site towards the town centre, the Worth Way, which is National Cycle Route 21. So just to reinforce that message that this really is a highly sustainable site that has real potential to achieve higher levels of modal shift outlined within the plan. Moving then on to the traffic modelling, which was talked about and raised by Mr. Wedderburn again there. He recognises within the infrastructure first evidence that there is a need to fully understand how traffic behaves on this part of the network using a corridor-wide traffic model. As he said, there was one done in 2012 which formed part of the then up-to-date Atkins study. Obviously, that's somewhat out of date now, and things obviously have generally moved on from 2012 to 2019, when our updated model has been undertaken. This is a VISM model which has been produced with close liaison with West Sussex County Council. Indeed, it uses the same modelling scope and extents as the previous 2012 model, but obviously has included most more up-to-date traffic flow data, and all the parameters have been updated to include all committed developments and committed schemes, and all neighbourhood plan sites as well are all included within that model. The model's been validated and calibrated and has been signed off by West Sussex and agreed as being fit for purpose for the context of evaluating the impact of this site. It's on that basis that we obviously have submitted that evidence. In terms of the numbers and the costings that were alluded to there, in terms of the figures of 10 to 18 million. Now, we'd actually question quite where they have come from. Obviously, the Atkins do minimum schemes at Lingfield Road and at the Felbridge Junction represent committed schemes for which we understand there is funding already in place for those. So obviously that is not something that would form part of that very large number that was mooted there. Furthermore, in terms of the bus lane scheme, which I can only assume forms part of that very large number, it's our understanding that the bus lane scheme is not currently programmed by West Sussex. It's being further investigated and therefore shouldn't necessarily be a detailed consideration within the context of the site allocations DPD. Furthermore, the HIF bid, which was discussed there, also is not considered to be related to the improvements within this corridor, and certainly those which are suggested within our reports. Without going into too much detail in regards to the modelling, because obviously the results have been provided and appended to our hearing statement, there were two sets of modelling which have been done. One which contains all the entire development and improvements at those three key junctions, being Linfield Road, Felbridge, and Imberhorn Lane, and then a further set of modelling which provided a phased delivery of the development in conjunction with potential improvements coming forward at different times within that development. And you know, the general results of those were that those improvement schemes that we had shown within our report can provide strategic improvement to the operation of the A22-264 corridor and actually improve journey times relative to the future baseline position, even with the inclusion of our development. The second set of modelling provided comfort that a proportion of the development could come forward in advance of some and all of those schemes without having a severe impact on the network. And again, you know, this would be looked at in further detail to determine potential trigger points and the specific nature of the schemes as part of any planning application, and that process and rationale was agreed in principle with West Sussex.
What do you say to the point that these proposed junction improvements are not actually in as specific proposals or policies within this plan? What will be your response to that?
I mean, as I say, we've always been clear in this that the work that we've been doing is to determine whether there are solutions there and whether schemes would in fact be deliverable. It's not to say that these would be the final answer in terms of the schemes that would be put in place. That would be determined at planning application stage with further work with West Sussex to determine the specific nature of those schemes at the appropriate time.
Somebody had to make that mistake about East and West Sussex.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it would be the highway consultant.
I'm surprised we've gone so far. Right, okay. At the planning application stage, getting back to work. Right, Sasha White, do come in.
Thank you, sir. I'll be very brief. Can I just add and endorse the comments made by my colleagues for Welbeck? Can I just make 2 points, please, sir? First of all, I, like you, have read all the representations about this proposed allocation, and I would submit that a fair judgment is that actually there is very little butcher's bill about this site when you consider its magnitude. We're talking about an allocation just shy of 65 hectares, and as you've identified, a very significant scale cumulatively for what is sought to be allocated. And what is noteworthy of the concerns and objections is how little standout issues there are, frankly. And I would go as far to say actually, the more one reads the objections, the more it actually leads to a conclusion that the LPA have got this right. So that's my first point. So the second point, I just want to make a point in answer to Mr. Lopez. And you know how barristers often can't not respond to their colleagues, but Mr. Lopez's point about policy EG2A in the neighbourhood plan, I just think frankly is wrong, with the greatest respect, and I love him dearly, but it's just wrong, because policy EG2A, so if you look at, deals expressly with planning permission will not normally be granted for development. So I don't believe as a matter of law in the operation of 38.6, or even in the context of the task before you, it is relevant for considering allocations in the effectively in the site allocations document. And in any event, it does.
Again for me. You said deals with.
Effectively, it's a development control policy in the strictest terms. It says planning permission will not normally be granted.
Thank you.
So it's simply not relevant for the task that you have in hand of whether you endorse or do not endorse the allocations that this LPA is considering at this stage. It's a development control policy and not one that was ever intended to do the role that Mr. Lopez alludes to, or Infrastructure First does. So that's my simple point. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for your brevity. Mr. Barnby, can you be equally brief for me? There's a question for you. Are you there? Have we lost Mr. Barnby? In which case I'll bring in Councillor Ian Gibson.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for tolerating my late hand. I've got 2 points that I just want to put across to you. The first is the statement of common ground, and I'm indebted to Charlotte for bringing that to my attention last Friday, seeing as the County Council hadn't bothered to do so, even though I'm the elected member now. They have since provided me with a briefing, which I think should have been come out before from last Tuesday. I'll just confirm the point made by Miss Lamb that the West Sussex Capital Appraisal Board is in fact undertaking a feasibility study that will include due diligence on the potential land swap, and that might be of interest to you. But I also see that they designate the access as a second vehicular access, and as far as I can see, it's the primary access for getting into the major part of the site. And I will be writing back to them later today in order to draw that to their attention, since I only received it at 5:30 last night. The second point is gaps, and you may remember that I talked about gaps yesterday in relation to SA22. I've been out measuring things again, but I'll start by observing that regarding the East Grinstead neighbourhood plan, the objectives, the final one is to protect the countryside and open spaces for the landscape, wildlife, agriculture, recreation, natural resource value. And I think that is really what the intention of policy EG2A is, preventing coalescence. But I can confirm absolutely that on the other side of the divide, and this site is not within the Corley Down neighbourhood plan area, but policy 8C of the Crawley Down neighbourhood plan is specifically intended to prevent significant impact on strategic gaps. And in this case, you have to measure the impact along the Worth Way. You've heard it's a Sustrans route as part of the National Cycle Network. The impact of this development is 50% of that gap is taken away. And I'd be happy to, I doubt whether the Worth Way has been one of the routes which you've actually followed, but I'd be delighted to walk along it with you in the fine sunshine that we have down here. Thank you.
Very kind of you. Right, Mr. Lopez, if you're very brief, I'll give you a final word before we break for lunch, and then I'll invite the council to come in first thing after lunch, and there'll be no further discussion at that time from anybody else. Mr. Lopez.
Very good of you, and I promise to be brief. I did draw emphasis upon, in relation to Mr. White's point, paragraph 410, which comes just before you'll see policy EG2, which does, in whatever context it be read, whether straying into development management or a plan making stage, the emphasis is very clear. The importance of protecting areas that are caught by EG2 and EG2A in order to ensure that development doesn't result in that merger or coalescence. And so that bites, that importance still bites at the plan making stage, even if Mr. White is right in a rather constrained view, I might say, of reading EG2 and EG2A as simply biting only in relation to whether planning permission be granted on a site-specific basis. So even if you're attracted by Mr. White's point, and I hear that, still the emphasis lies in paragraph 410, and it makes substantially the very same point.
Thank you for that. We're just coming up to lunch. Mr. Brown, how long do you think you might be in picking up the points that have been made?
So I'm getting hungry, so I'd be inclined to try and keep it under 5 minutes or so. I'm possibly 10 at most, but if we could,
that's very encouraging.
Start with that, and that would allow other parties who aren't perhaps so interested in sites coming on this afternoon to go off and do their own thing without needing to rejoin us.
That's a very fair point. I'll give you 5 to 10 minutes.
I'm grateful. So can I start with Tim Burden's points about C2? And so it's very clear, he very fairly said, he's not objecting in principle. What he's seeking is a tweak to the policy in relation to C2. He has 2 elements of that. One of them is being more specific about exactly what the C2 involves. And so on that issue, the council's simple answer is there is no need to. I mean, as you will remember from the discussion last week, there are a range of types of C2 provision. To the extent that there is a need within the district, it's as likely to pick up one particular model of provision as it is another. From the council's perspective, anything that fell within that would be a welcome contribution on this site. And there is no need to be more prescriptive. I mean, the point is, the policy does require C2. C2, I mean, there are variations within it, but it is different from C3. And if the developer were to come forward with something which had no C2 in it, then we would be objecting to it because that would not be in accordance with the policy. So the provision, the reference there to C2 is enough to secure something which will go to meet that part of the district's needs. So the second element of Mr. Burden's observation was that there's no quantitative reference in the policy. So that is true. The council's experience is that these things generally have some sort of critical mass behind them in any event. So you're unlikely to get somebody coming forward with a care home for just 1 or 2 places and arguing that meets the need. I think the council's perspective, sir, is that it's not necessary to be more prescriptive. However, I heard Katie Lamb's indication that they would not be averse to that. If you felt it was necessary or helpful, and I'm not suggesting that you should, and I'm not asking you to go away and direct us to do something that's unnecessary, but if you felt it would be useful to have some sort of indicative number in there, that is a conversation we would be very happy to have with developers and perhaps come back to you with a proposed modification. Our starting position, however, is that is not necessary. So I turn then to John Litton's observations. You said, sir, or rather invited me to respond to his suggestion that the council has been cherry picking in the way it's gone about things. So I'll deal with this as succinctly and politely as I know how in circumstances where, in the case of this allocation, you have a site where the land ownership issues are essentially resolved. We know there is a discussion being had with West Sussex in terms of the access arrangements, but you've heard the conversations that have been taking place in that regard. The progress has been made. This is a site where you have a developer on board, not just land ownership issues resolved, but a developer on board. This is a site where, as Katie Lamb explained, there have been over 6 years worth of work in terms of working out what the site can accommodate, in terms of discussions with the county council on how to address highways issues, and where there is a very high level of work for a site allocation, not for planning. Well, indeed, as you've heard from Katie Lamb, they're getting to the point where there is enough to support a planning application. At an allocation level, that is more than adequate. So you may feel that there is a world of difference between that and the position at Crabbett Park, where there is no formal agreement between the landowners in relation to how that site will be brought forward, where there is no developer on board, where there is very little, if anything, by way of discussions, for example, in terms of with Highways England as to how you might accommodate the need for a brand new junction on the motorway. This is not a case of cherry picking. The council has very clear criteria, and there are very, very good reasons why we have drawn a distinction between Crabbett Park and the proposals at Imberhorn. So in terms of infrastructure first observations, I want first of all just to stand back and place everything that's been said in context, because in my submission, there has to be an air of reality about the way one looks at this. The district plan requires us to make provision for a certain level of need. It requires us to direct that provision to the most sustainable settlements. It identifies East Grinstead as a category 1 settlement. Of itself, that means that development, or it dictates certain things as to where development is going to go. And so you will know that practically wherever we have tried directing the development, somebody has complained. One of the other category 1 settlements, Burgess Hill, so you'll recall Dr. Bowe's objections last week to the fact that we put too much on Burgess Hill. We put too much on Burgess Hill, we put too much on East Grinstead, we have put too much on Pease Pottage. Also, once you take those out, you lose all your category 1 settlements, and the question is, where else are we supposed to be putting things? The reality is, this is precisely the sort of place where one should be looking to seek to place new development. As you've heard in the submissions made by the developer, this is highly sustainable. It's on the edge of East Grinstead. It has very, very good connections in terms of access to facilities. And frankly, sir, if a site like this is not appropriate, then where in the world can or should we be seeking to meet a need? There is a very good reason why this is the single largest allocation in the site allocations DPD. It is entirely because amongst all the various sites that we have looked at, including other sites around East Grinstead, around other category 1 settlements, this is an outstanding site. And so I noted what Sasha White said about the lack of weight for objections for a site of this scale, and I respectfully agree with that. When one considers this is the single largest allocation, if one looks at the criticisms that are made of it, they are extraordinarily thin in the circumstances. So I think finally, just deal with the point about neighbourhood plan. First of all, you already have the points that we made last week, because the key issue that Mr. Lopez identifies arising out of the neighbourhood plan is a policy dealing with coalescence. So you know that in terms of the criteria we applied in selecting sites, coalescence was not identified as a freestanding criterion, and there is a reason for that, because one doesn't find the word coalescence anywhere in the NPPF. Our criteria are all selected on the basis of principles that one finds set out in the NPPF. So that's quite an important point, because it does raise the question, although obviously one of the things you need to look at is, or we need to look at is, relationship with the neighbourhood plan. If coalescence is not of itself a criteria that's relevant at this stage, to what extent should it be brought in, as it were, by the back door through a neighbourhood plan? But so even if, and to the extent that it does, and I note also in this regard what Sajal White QC has said in relation to whether there is in fact a conflict with the neighbourhood plan, but so even if there were, I mean, the whole point about the way in which the NPPF sets this out, subsequent plans can, and in certain circumstances will necessarily overtake their predecessors. This is a neighbourhood plan which did not, it's not a criticism of it, but it did not anticipate the growing needs of the district. We are now at the point where that needs to happen. This is one of the Category 1 settlements. This is one of the most sustainable sites. And if that means that there is a conflict with the neighbourhood plan, then regrettably, so be it. But that is entirely consistent with national policy. So there is an issue which I would leave you to consider on site, and that is whether in fact there is a material point in relation to coalescence. So you will experience for yourself the extent to which, certainly in terms of the public transport, the road highway network, there is already significant coalescence between Felbridge and East Grinstead, and what you see in terms of both SA19 and SA20 is that they are both accessed from independent parts. The SA19 clearly from within Felbridge, SA20 from clearly within East Grinstead. There's no way in which you could get from one to the other without clearly going through the main part of East Grinstead. In terms of the gap between the two, there will still be a gap between the two settlements. And so as a matter of judgment, we wouldn't accept that there is a concern about coalescence if insofar as it was raised. But I do make that submission very much as the braces that go with the belt, because our starting point is we need to meet the needs. If there is any issue in terms of coalescence, if there is any degree of conflict with the neighbourhood plan, that is a necessary consequence of meeting the need in the most sensible and sustainable location. So thank you.
Thank you. Just before we close, you suggested, Mr. Brown, a conversation you'd be happy to have regarding C2 in particular uses in relation to SA20. I would like you to have that conversation. I'd like a note or a statement to common ground on where you come to with that and what kind of policy wording. I agree with you on your first point about being precise about pinning down particular C2, C3 type of use. But on the quantum point, I do have some sympathy with that point. And I would like the two of you and maybe Bart and Wilmore, because they've made a big play on this as well, but maybe the three of you could get together on this and come out with a note for me. That would be very helpful.
Certainly we will endeavour to do that. So I'm quite sure that we can come to a statement of common ground with the developer, and if it's possible to bring Ms. Burden in as well, then we will do that. And if not, you might have a three-way statement of common and uncommon ground, but at least we can provide something to you.
That's very helpful. We'll now close for lunch. It'll be shorter, I think. We've still got 3 sites to get through. So we'll start back again bang on 2 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And we need to all log out.